Hello curious people, today I am here to help you. I know you are using this video to help you fall asleep. So before you like this video and subscribe to the channel, tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Make yourself comfortable now. I stepped into the stories. I've been working part-time at the local movie theater for a year now to earn some extra money while I'm studying. I love movies more than anything, and I especially love watching them on the big screen. Though I can't have that experience in my job, because I'm limited to. After a while, I was so engrossed in the movie that I only noticed the bright light next to me later. Mina was texting on her cell phone. Her screen brightness wasn't even turned down. I couldn't believe it. You too. Some visitors behind us wrinkled their noses in annoyance, and an elderly man in our row gave us reproachful looks. I was extremely embarrassed. I whispered to Mina to put the damn phone away, and luckily, she did as told and concentrated on the movie again. I thought I could enjoy the rest of the film without any further interruptions, but barely 5 minutes had passed when the next crisis began. Mina kept turning around and making shushing noises, as if the people behind her were talking loudly. I turned around too, but the visitors were completely silent, but also just as perplexed as I was. Suddenly, Mina flinched as if she had been frightened by something. The film hadn't been a real shocker so far, and there was no reason for her to have been frightened by it. "Stop! What's going on?" she whispered, looking in all directions. "What's the matter?" I asked, also whispering. "Tell those idiots to stop staring at me like that." I looked in the direction she meant, but all I saw was the elderly man in our row, a few young people in front of us, and the visitors behind us. They were all fixated on the screen. "Nobody is staring at you," I said vehemently, but Mina continued to act as if she was being harassed with looks. I wasn't sure if she was just fooling around or if she was having a psychotic episode, but if the latter was the case, I'd never seen anything like it before. As far as I knew, she had no history of mental disorders, but I'd only known her for a few months too. Meanwhile, the other moviegoers were also noticing her and were making shushing noises and complaining verbally. "They have to stop looking at me like that. Please do something, Andy." She started to whimper. It was disturbing to watch. I decided that the film wasn't worth it anyway and walked out of the auditorium with her. The young people in front of us applauded maliciously. "Show your girl Wicked instead. No diapers needed." When we reached the exit, Mina immediately rushed to the women's restroom and barricaded herself there for a few minutes. I waited and kept wondering what had gotten into her. I'd never seen such a behavior from her. She always tried to avoid strong emotions in public. Finally, she came out of the restroom, and I took her in my arms and gently stroked her back. She seemed to have calmed down. "Don't ever send me back there," she whispered hoarsely. "I won't. The movie was a flop anyway." "No, don't ever bring me back here, ever," she backed up. I nodded, even though I didn't understand it. Whatever was going on, it had to come from herself. I myself and the other moviegoers didn't see anything that she thought she had seen, but I kept my promise and never took her to the movies again. The next day, before my shift, I called Mina and asked her how she was doing. She said she was feeling better after sleeping and took the day off. I recommended that she watch her show again to clear her head, and she gratefully accepted the offer. After that, I came to my shift and joined my colleague and friend Albert to clear an auditorium and sweep the leftover popcorn off the seats and floors. "How was the film yesterday?" Albert asked, amused. "I heard it made a huge loss. I bet there was hardly anyone here except you and Mina. It definitely wasn't a Cronenberg, but it wasn't necessarily a flop like Alone in the Dark. I don't know. I didn't even see the ending." "You didn't see the ending?" Albert asked, surprised. "You of all people are leaving the theater early." I laughed slightly to tone down my incoming answer. There was something wrong with Mina. She really wanted to get out. I don't know if it was the movie or if she has some problem she doesn't want to talk about, but I guess it's the movie. She isn't that into horror. Albert sat up straight. His expression was suddenly serious. What exactly did she do that made her want to get out? I don't know. It was as if she felt like she was being stared at. But there was hardly anything going on in the hall, I would have noticed. Albert remained serious. Was she using her cell phone? I also stopped sweeping and stared at Albert attentively. I nodded. Dude, why didn't you make it clear to her that she should turn it off? It's just a push of a button. What do you mean? I asked, perplexed. We don't have that sign over there for nothing. He pointed to the door to the auditorium, where the well-known PLESE turn OFF, your CELFONI during TE film, CREE9 was written. They even make these announcements during the commercials. Albert, almost everyone ignores this rule. But almost everyone should know by now what happens to you if you take out your phone during a movie screening. I was gradually getting fed up with this game and demanded clarification from him. Then he started to talk. I don't know when or where it started, and I only know most of it from Reddit forums, but people who take out their phones during a movie screening are said to notice things that no one else notices. It always starts with a voice whispering something to them. It's supposed to be some random voice, but I've read that some people heard the voices of their parents or even the actors from the movie they were watching at the time. In any case, the whispering is said to turn into staring faces. Here, too, there are different experiences. Most people only saw the evil-looking faces of the moviegoers. The look is said to be unpleasantly horrific. Someone even compared the look to that of Tommy Wiseau from the infamous The Room poster. But others also saw more than just the moviegoers' faces. They even saw the actors from the movie, family members, or just random strangers. All the faces only disappeared when you left the auditorium. But the horror didn't end there. In fact, every time most victims sit down in front of a screen, be it a theater screen, the television, or even just their mobile phone, the faces appear again and steal their attention. And the more often you sit in front of the screen, the more diabolical the faces are said to be. They make ugly faces, blood drips from their eyes, and spits from their mouths. Their faces become more and more distorted, and their voices get louder and say scary things. I got the willies just reading it. I was now sitting in one of the seats, listening intently, work completely neglected. I liked Albert and enjoyed working alongside him. And I liked horror stories as much as the next guy, but I just couldn't understand how he could believe such nonsense. At least that was my first reaction. Maybe it was the way he told the facts. As if I was a little kid who didn't want to sleep, and he was telling me the story to scare me. I'm going to look into it myself, I eventually said, not trying to sound incredulous. Take care of Minna, man, he said in conclusion. We finished our work, this time in a hurry because the next screening was about to start. We didn't say one word to each other. I decided to skip work today and visit Minna. I was still a little upset about the things Albert had told me and wanted to be more certain. I thought Minna would know better. When I reached her apartment door, I noticed that it was open. I called out to her and waited for an answer that never came. I entered and carefully moved towards her room. She shared this apartment with her roommate Anna, who must have been at work at the time. I eventually stopped, the sight of her room sending me into a state of mild shock. It was a total mess. The furniture, her desk, and her wardrobe had been knocked over and broken. Slats from her bed frame were lying everywhere. Ripped out, her chandelier was still hanging by a single cord that was struggling to stay on. Her iPad and iPhone were destroyed and in shards next to a broken blender that was still plugged in. But what worried me the most were the walls. Holes had been smashed here and there. Red stains were spreading around some of the holes. Scratch marks had been left on almost every corner, also covered in blood. Next to them were blood-red and smudged handprints. I suddenly heard a thud coming from the living room. I carefully walked in the direction of the sound of chairs clattering and stomping, bracing myself for the worst. The living room looked undamaged. Apart from the huge flat-screen TV, which was now just a huge pile of broken glass, and a ceiling lamp that had been torn down and had a long rope hanging from its bracket. Minna came out of the corner, and the sight of her made me cry. Her beautiful dark blonde hair had been ripped out and crumpled in several places. Her eyes were black with soaked mascara. She was only wearing an oversized shirt that was stained with blood. Her hands were massacred from the chaos she'd made in her room. I could hardly see any nails. She stared at me but didn't say a word. I couldn't read her expression. It seemed as if she'd been crying, but now she seemed relaxed and almost relieved. She pushed me aside and dragged a chair into the middle of the room. It wasn't until she stood on it that the penny dropped for me. "Please don't do that." I ran towards her and held her tight. "But that's the only way I won't hear them anymore," she said in a whisper. It no longer sounded like a deliberate whisper, but more like a croak caused by damaged vocal cords. "Why didn't you call me? I would've been here sooner," I moaned. I heard quiet sobs from above. I wanted to. I really wanted to. I looked up and saw her distorted face, her bright red eyes, which were so drained of tears that she could hardly produce any more tears. "I'm here now," I said gently. "I'll help you, I promise." She shook her head. "Just give me time." She didn't say anything, but I managed to get her down from the chair. I didn't let go of her hand while I called 911. I tried to explain what had happened to the physicians carefully, and with a reasonable sounding story. I'd rather not share that, because I find the story itself just laughable, but the physicians were convinced enough to put Minna in a protective unit so she couldn't hurt herself anymore. It's been 2 weeks since the whole thing, and I've been trying to reach Minna since she was admitted. I know she couldn't answer the phone herself, but the facility couldn't get around to calling me back. What if something bad had happened? What if they put her in front of a screen and gave her the clockwork orange treatment? And she certainly couldn't explain what was wrong with her. Yesterday I was at work and made one call after another, but it always went to voicemail. Albert assured me that Minna was in good hands. He and I had made it our mission to take the cell phone policy more seriously. Before entering, we explained to every visitor that their cell phone had to be turned off and that they had to leave the auditorium in case of an emergency. We explained that it was due to poor lighting and signal interference. It was particularly difficult to explain the situation to young people and small children. In the worst case, we took turns standing in front of the door and watching the visitors with a keen eye. As I took my position, I looked out into the crowd and flinched at every little movement. But it seemed that most people took the warning to heart. If only I'd known about this curse beforehand, I could have warned Minna too. Speaking of Minna, while I was at my position, I finally received my long-awaited call, and I quickly answered it as some moviegoers noticed it. An employee from the institution assured me that Minna was fine and that she would be able to receive visitors in a few days. I hung up, relieved. Immediately afterwards, however, I heard the employee's voice again, only in a whisper. I turned around, but there was only the closed door. I turned back to the theater and froze when I saw the venomous looks of the visitors directed at me. "My name is Mike. I'm 23 years old, and I work at a small coffee shop in a quiet village. None of that matters anymore. I just want to tell you what happened before I stand on the edge of this cliff. It started last week. I woke up like any other morning, had a quick breakfast, and prepared to leave for work. Outside, the weather was harsh, one of the biggest storms I had ever seen. I grabbed my umbrella and stepped out the door, but something was wrong. It wasn't just water falling from the sky. People, yes, people were falling. I froze in disbelief. One landed close to me, motionless. My heart raced as I stumbled back inside the house and shut the door. From my window, I watched the chaos unfold outside. The storm lasted for hours. I didn't call work because I knew everyone must have seen it. When it finally stopped, I gathered my courage and stepped outside. The village was empty, eerily silent. The streets were scattered with still bodies. I walked around, hoping to find someone, anyone who had survived, but I didn't. It felt as if the entire village had been wiped out. People I recognized, neighbors, friends, were lying there. I checked the rooftops, the roads everywhere. I couldn't make sense of it. There were no news reports, no phone calls answered, nothing. I felt completely alone. That night, walking back to my house was terrifying. The silence was unnerving. No cars, no voices, just emptiness. I thought I wouldn't sleep, but exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off almost instantly. The next morning, another storm came. I woke up to the sound of pounding rain and looked out my window. It was happening again. More people were falling. At first, I thought it was the same bodies being tossed around by the wind, but when the storm subsided, I realized these were new. There were twice as many as before. Something felt even stranger this time. Every single one of them looked alike. Male with black hair, just like me. I couldn't understand it. Why were they identical? Why were they falling? Over the next few days, the storm kept returning. It would start like clockwork around 7 a.m., sometimes lasting an hour, sometimes all day. With each storm, the number of bodies increased. They piled up in yards, on roofs, and in the streets. Some would even hit the walls of my house, making soft thuds that sent chills down my spine. I thought about leaving the village, taking a car, and driving far away. But I couldn't. My mind felt too heavy, too overwhelmed by everything I had seen. Every time I stepped outside, I saw faces that looked just like mine. It was as if I was watching pieces of myself fall from the sky. Now, I stand here, looking out over the edge of a cliff. The storm is returning, and I know what comes next. Maybe I'll find answers. Maybe I won't. But I can't stay here any longer, watching myself fall over and over again. The national news didn't say anything about what was happening. I didn't find anything about it on the internet. But then, where were the bodies coming from? The whole village was dead on the first day of the storm, but a week later there are still hundreds of new bodies falling. As the days went on, the bodies started to look more and more like me. It was so uncanny. I just basically grabbed as much food as I could from the empty store and hid in my house. Weeks went by like this. Every day, I was thinking about ending it all. And when I didn't have any more food left and went out again, I froze as I stepped out of my door. Every dead body looked like me. And they weren't just similar. They were exact copies of me, like clones or twins of me. After I was able to overcome the initial shock, I decided to finally grab a random car and drive as far as I could from this hell. I grabbed my now dead neighbor's car and drove as fast as I could. I drove 2 hours before I reached the nearest city. When I finally arrived, I quickly found a parking lot, then quickly jumped out of the car. I was so happy I could finally see living people. But they all looked like me. They looked at me like I was crazy. But they were all copies of me. I ran away. Now I'm here, standing at the edge of this cliff. I hope someone will find this recording and solve this mystery. I won't. Audio recording ends. Fascinating, isn't it? It's amazing how a brain alone can imagine a whole life for itself, and how easily it could turn into a nightmare after some small electrical impulses. Although it's an interesting subject, I find these experiments unethical, and I don't want them to continue. But nobody listens to me. I shared this because I want people to know about the experiments. Maybe a negative public opinion can convince them to stop. Best wishes, Jacob, CIA. Project Brain in a Jar. My grandmother just confessed to a sinister war story that happened to all the soldiers in training. Dead. It was the worst disaster to happen to me. Do you have everything, Claire? He shouted as he locked the front door and began to trot towards the car. Yes, I have everything except battery. I deeply sighed as I peered at my blank phone, then out of the window. The door opened beside me as he climbed in and closed it. With a small chuckle, he then replied, "Well, now you have the whole journey to talk with me. How about that?" The orange and pink streaks were dragged along the sky like paint on a canvas. I noticed the silence amongst us, my eyes dragging itself to sleep, but at the same time my mind raced with annoyance and confusion. Biting my lip, I watched the view change. So did the atmosphere that surrounded me. Julian, I trailed off as his right hand tightened around the steering wheel. He then did a small hum, staring in front of the road ahead of us. I don't get the point. I mean, come on. Why are we doing? Enough. He shot harshly as he flicked the small black button, and a delicate tune resonated out the radio. I propped my head up against the window and looked out at the houses that now flew by us. It was every Saturday morning, where I found myself driving with Julian. But it was as if he didn't realize things anymore. I managed to sit comfortably and shut my eyes for a few moments until I was woken up by a sharp jolt of the car, and he gently tapped my shoulder. I glanced at the white cottage that tucked itself behind the tall green trees that swayed with the wind. The home sat on its own away from civilian life. The crystalline window stared into me. As I opened the car door, the sharp grass beneath my feet pricked me. It was reminding us that we were here, and we could quickly leave now. Julian followed my movements after me, locking the car. We both gave each other a look and started to walk towards the old white gate that wrapped around the entire home. The garden filled with pink roses and yellow tulips that glared at us as we strolled towards the white door. Remember, no phone, and do not ask for anything. You hear me? He sternly commanded as I nodded quickly, trying to dismiss the wooden platform beneath us that constantly creaked in disturbance. Knock, knock, knock. A faint cluttering sound came from the door handle, and then it gradually opened. There she was. The lines on her face was like a map of time stretched out, meeting with the strands of curly gray hair that laid evenly on the top of her head in a bun. Eyes danced upon us as a charming smile rose from her beautiful cheeks that showed her dimples. "Hello, Grandma. How are you?" I asked politely as I leaned in for a hug. "I am quite all right, dear. You?" Her sweet voice flowed into my ears as she gave me a soft kiss on the cheek and allowed us in. The smell of freshly baked cookies eased the tension that I had previously felt. Come in, darlings, sit in this room," Grandma offered us as we walked through the hallway and into the large living room. The living room had a large glass cabinet that stored heaps of books that were older than me inside. Mountains and scenery were drawn and framed as paintings. Each turn you took, they hung up neatly on the wall. My eyes transfixed onto the pile of paperwork that was messily strewn across the wooden table in front of me. I finally sat down on her sofa that pulled me deeper inside with every small movements to archive a comfortable position. She gradually walked towards the living room holding a plate of cookies and an old tatty book in her other hand. "Where's Francis?" Julian asked immediately as she placed the plate on the table and slowly began to sit down at the single sofa chair. "He's currently at the market buying some apricots that I love," Grandma cheerfully exclaimed as Julian did a low grunt and looked over at me with darting eyes. "Oh, Grandma, do you have? Claire, would you like some of my oat biscuits?" Grandma offered as I glared at the dry biscuits and eventually gave in, delicately taking one from the plate and nibbling down on it. Grandma held the book in her arms as if she was guarding it with her life. I noticed Julian staring out at the window. The sun dipped beneath the grassy hills that were sound asleep. The small birds hopped from one branch to another, then fluttered away from the jarring wind that poked and pried at the area. I turned to Grandma, her worn hands now turning the pages of a small book that I couldn't work out what it was. The comforting silence swept through the old cottage as a sharp thought treaded in my mind. "What are you reading?" I questioned in a curious tone as I felt a pair of annoyed eyes trace up my body. "Ooh, it's an old story, rather peculiar," Grandma whispered as I felt my heart flip with excitement. I needed something to cure the boredom I feel every Saturday. I couldn't stand the thought of sitting and waiting till tea arrived. "What's it about?" I asked, more curious than ever as she turned the page to the start of the book and handed it to me. "Claire," Julian trailed off as I huffed and took the old book in my hands. The smooth leathery case tucked inside my palms as I admired the small engravings of unknown symbols and words. "Would you like to know a little secret about Grandpa Francis?" she asked with a smile as I nodded eagerly as Julian rose from his seat and came next to me. "Doris, we talked about this," he snapped as he tried to take the book from my hands, but I swerved it away. I opened the book. I assumed it was going to be a prehistoric tale or a gruesome folklore to warn children. But it was a medium-sized Polaroid photo that was evenly stuck inside the first page. "That is Francis when he was young." Grandma chuckled as my immediate question was answered hastily. The teenage boy held a small rifle cradled in his arms. He had a flock of brown hair that was neatly brushed to one side. His eyes were narrowed with a chilling dead glare at the camera. Young Francis wore a green camouflaged shirt and trousers with thick black boots. He stood behind a cobblestone wall. The sky was bright, and everything was normal. However, I couldn't help but feel a shiver trace down my spine as my eyes were drawn to his face. "Let me tell you about my Francis before he comes home, darling." Grandma beamed as she took the book from my hands and cleared her throat and said, "We were still together, trying to figure out our lives after our newborn died years earlier. That was when he had to enlist. Soon enough, he had to leave for thorough training." "State your name, Private," the chubby man ordered as a young man walked to the table and replied. Francis Iverson," the male stated with a soft smile as he stood upright carrying his backpack on his shoulders and a book in his hands. "Straight through the hall, go outside, and find the second large wooden bunk, where you will be staying," the man lazily said as he pointed at the glass door. The young male pushed the door open. His mouth was agape as he looked upon the grassy wide fields that stretched out far beyond. He looked at the young men that ran laps around the paved tracks, climbed walls whilst clenching the ropes with all their strengths. He could hear the distant yelling of men ordering the other soldiers to climb faster up the wall as he began to slowly trot to his barrack. The wooden bunker sat further away from where he was originally walking. Many of these bunkers were spread out meters apart as his eyes lingered upon the very few men heading into the bunker he was currently going to. The metal door was already propped open as he stepped in nervously. Before he could utter a single word, a young man rushed towards him. "Hey, we got a new recruit." The man snickered as he wrapped his arm around Francis tightly, as if he was wrestling with him. A group of men stared at Francis, taking in his appearance, checking if he was a good enough soldier. "Oi you, what's your name?" A rough voice broke the silence as another person approached Francis rudely. The man had short curly brown hair that was neatly trimmed to a standard. His light brown eyes were narrowed, glaring at the boy who stood cluelessly in the doorway. "Francis Iverson." The man who wrapped his arm around the boy slightly moved away and sat on his bed watching. "You can't stay here, the bunk is full. Try somewhere else." The soldier coldly grunted, the room becoming more intense as Iverson let out an awkward chuckle. "Dooley, what do you mean? I was assigned here," he blurted as the other young man clenched his fists. But before anyone could say a thing, a loud knock resonated the room. "You lot. I too old you to be da one there, in 5 minutes. What's taking so long?" A slim, tensed man was standing at the doorway. He wore the usual brown uniform and thick black boots. Francis realized immediately that he was the sergeant. Soon enough, all the soldiers that were scattered around the bunker darted outside, towards the flat ground, away from the training equipment, as the sergeant casually walked towards them. All soldiers stood upright in a long line, waiting. "Before we start the exercise, I want all of you to welcome our latest recruit, Francis Iverson, who will be joining us for the 13-week training." The man strolls to Iverson and shakes his hand with a dark glare, then carries on pacing up and down the line. "Now, I want to see some stretches before we begin the push-ups and squat jumps." "Yes, sir." They boomed in unison as the young men began the task. The sunny morning dragged on as the soldiers finished their marches, learning the basics about their weapons, and a tough exercise. A black sheet casted itself amongst the sky as the men began to walk back to their barracks after supper was done. "Hey, Iverson, wait up," a fellow soldier called, making Francis turn around and smile. "Hey, you must be Charles. Charles Everett, at your service," mocked the young boy with a grin, making Francis chuckle, easing the aches he felt in every limb of his body. The boy had smooth blonde hair that parted to one side of his head, his shiny blue eyes, and a relaxed expression that plastered across his face. The two men introduced themselves better, chattered about their training and the tense atmosphere that Francis had experienced. "What's up with that guy anyway?" Francis spoke quietly as they were a few steps away from their bunk. "Oh, I don't know him that well, but some bloke told me he's a spiteful guy. Don't worry about it." Charles calmly reassured the worried boy as he patted Francis's back and glided through the other soldiers that were in front of them rapidly. "You see, my Francis trained for a while. They learned many things about their weapons and combat skills. But there was a day that was, well, different." Grandma continued. Her eyes that previously danced with excitement were dark and jittered across the room. It was within a week before Francis knew the proper ways to hold his bayonet and his warm-ups to exceed his strengths. He knew training was going to be difficult, especially when his muscles grown day by day, but he carried on. The soldiers were seated in their bunks, ready for the evening when the sergeant stormed into their room. He held his nose up high, eyes moving across the paper rapidly before he glared at each of them sternly. "All of your routines have changed. Tomorrow you will be seated in the meeting room," he commanded as all the soldiers stopped moving their duvet sheets around, and with a puzzling look they stared back at the sergeant. "Sir, may I ask why?" piped one of the soldiers that was lying down on his bed. Francis was also thinking the same question, holding his small leather book clutched in his hand. "This is training. Do not think that all of you will have a day off." And with that, the sergeant disappeared into the night with a loud bang from the metal door. It was a bright morning. The soldiers had to walk far out from where they previously trained into this large white building where the meetings were held. The sergeant led them into a room with a small television and many seats placed in rows. The tables stored at the back of this room. All the blinds were shut. "Now listen here. You will have to watch a video on this television. This will help with your techniques on the battlefield," added the slim man as the young soldiers sat down on the seats confused. It was not like anything before. They were glued to their seats, the videos flashing quickly as each of the soldiers' eyes were transfixed onto the blaring screen. Most normal people would call that torture clips, but everyone else named it special training. The special training lasted for weeks. Each video they watched was different. Screaming and crying of men or women, even children, as they went through a sickening experience that no one could process. Then they went back to their bunks in silence. "Hey, Francis, what's up with you there? You looked shit scared." The soldiers trudged to their barrack as Francis heard a chuckle behind him. The young man felt disturbed. He could not wrap his mind around the special training. Yes, they are going to protect their country from the enemy, but torturing them wasn't his intention. "I'm not scared. It's just not normal for us to watch something so appalling." Francis stood silently next to his bed as tension filled the air. The other boy, Iverson, lingered nearly a meter away, arms crossed, his voice sharp and unwavering. "What? You think avoiding the training is going to change anything?" Iverson shot at him. "That isn't true," Francis replied calmly. Iverson scoffed. "Are you calling me a liar?" "I didn't say that." Before Francis could respond further, another voice chimed in from the corner. "Iverson thinks he doesn't need to watch the training clips. What's the point of enlisting then?" Francis clenched his fists. "Can't you just leave me alone? What's wrong with you?" A heavy silence fell over the room. The tension was thick, palpable. The sound of shuffling boots echoed as the others closed in around him, their expressions hard to read. Francis felt the weight of their eyes on him, full of judgment and something darker. Then the metal door creaked open. The sergeant entered, his cold gaze sweeping over the room. Francis looked at him desperately, shouting out for help, but the man stood there for only a moment. Without a word, the sergeant turned and slowly shut the door, leaving Francis alone with the others. Fear tightened in his chest. He couldn't move. The next morning, Francis woke to a dull ache and the faint scent of cold metal lingering in the air. He forced himself out of bed, hoping the fresh morning light would clear his head. Instead, the memory of the previous night stayed with him, heavy and unshakable. After breakfast, Francis rushed outside. He needed to talk to someone who would understand, someone he could trust. Charles Everett was the only name that came to mind. "Hey, Everett, wait up," Francis shouted across the field. Charles paused mid-step and turned around. His usual energetic presence was gone. Francis froze when he got closer, noticing the faint bruises beneath Charles's eyes and the trembling hands gripping a water bottle. Something had changed in him, something Francis couldn't yet explain. That night, after the day's special training, the two of them walked silently out of the meeting room. Their footsteps crunched against the gravel path, and the cool evening breeze surrounded them. Neither of them spoke, but the quiet felt heavier with every step. Francis looked up as they approached the hill. For a moment, he hesitated. It was as if he could feel something waiting for them up ahead, something that would change everything. What is that?" Charles stuttered as he wiped the exhaustion from his eyes. The street lamps flickered on near them like a domino effect, displaying the large field. The young males were stunned, their eyes drawn to what appeared to be a yellow tent propped up evenly on the side. Francis couldn't help but sense that chilling feeling creep down his spine. However, both men dismissed the unusual tent and headed back to their barracks to sleep. Bang, bang, bang. The thoughts of the tent disappeared from Francis's mind as each soldier was awoken by the banging of the sergeant on the door. "All of you GEP now, and line up outside immediate Eloi. Hurry up," he screamed as the door slammed shut, and each soldier groaned in exhaustion. The morning overcame the night very quickly. The soldiers slipped on their usual clothes and rushed outside to meet with the sergeant, who demanded them to line up in an upright formation and hold a bayonet in their hands like they practiced. The faint sound of snapping and a flash alerted Charles as he quickly swept behind Francis. "Hey, Iverson, how's it going?" he greeted dryly as Francis turned around and said, "I'm all right, just confused on why we are here. Well, I'm not doing what they tell me to do. Like what my mama says, if something feels or tastes utterly bitter for you, don't drink it or find a way to sweeten it up. Leave it," Charles stated as he heard a chuckle from behind him. "You sure your mama knows what she is talking about, Everett?" Charles turned to face his smirking man as laughter resonated within the line behind him. "You watch your mouth, Demetrius. Don't you talk about my mama like that." Charles spat. The rage seemed to build up piece by piece. Then he turned back to the line. Francis knew he was next in the line. Demetrius did not fear Charles. Instead, he continued to mock him. Each word or noise edged deeply into the boy. The rage fired up and up into large flames. Then, silence. Francis was next. But his eyes were focused on Charles, that grabbed the Demetrius behind him and slammed the boy onto the floor whilst he bashed his fists into the man's face repeatedly. It was as if there was nothing left on the young bloke. No sympathy or respect, no formality. Just pure violence. The scene happened so fast, but the words from the boy stuck with Francis. He couldn't take them out of his head, no matter how hard he tried. Francis couldn't move. He was detached from the world around him until the sergeant wavered his attention, and he stared coldly at the camera. The noise of yelling and beating filled air. "Say, cheese." Snap. Silence overcasted Francis's mind. The thoughts and feelings. His beautiful girlfriend that had no idea what was going on. It never bothered him because he just couldn't think. Only observe. After a while, the soldiers were back to training. holding the ropes whilst climbing up the large wooden wall. They weren't good enough. They slumped and let go of the rope. The energy and the will to serve their country was the only remaining thing that bled out of their dead souls. Francis wrote a lot of things in his small leather book. He was obsessed because he knew that it was the thing that kept him sane. He wrote about the incident, and what followed after that was a series of fights and tortures within the night. Some soldiers would go out and come back inside and provoke anyone they desired. That soldier would get beaten, and they always said the same thing, and he didn't know why. But they came along. A soft knock at the metal door that was already propped open, and a beautiful lady stood in the entrance, the sunlight seeping through the gloomy room. For a moment, Francis assumed it was an angel sent down from heaven. Her soft peachy skin and light hazel eyes that danced upon each soldier. She wore a light yellow coat with a small symbol on the side of it with her white shoes and brown shiny long hair. "Hello there, gentlemen. My name is Cornell Walters, and I am a part of a vast company that we think you would love," beamed the lady as she smiled widely, showing her pearly white teeth. There was a long silence throughout the bunk until one of the soldiers asked, What are you talking about?" The lady peered at the grim, pale-faced men that stood there taking in this woman. Their bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. Some had bruises, scratch marks, and dried blood from cuts on their arms and body, but others barely had any visible. "Well, why don't you lovelies follow me? We were in the process of packing up and leaving. However, it is a delight for all of you to catch a glimpse of it before we go," she chimed, as the soldiers looked at each other confused. Francis, on the other hand, didn't hesitate to grab his book and follow this woman outside onto the field. All the weary soldiers trailed after Cornell Walters. Her hair fluttered against the soft wind that hugged each man reassuringly. They walked across the field to the large tent that had many people in the same light yellow uniform. Francis glanced at the symbol that displayed a small circle and dots that surrounded it, like a sun. He couldn't keep his eyes off the equipment that they used. They had no care in the world as they gently packed the belongings in white boxes with the same symbol planted on it. Cornell Walters stopped in her tracks and watched the soldiers take in the scenery. "What do you call this, company?" added one of the soldiers. All the men turned back, also pondering the same question. Before anyone could utter a word, a faint sound of engines bellowed through the field. White Morris motor cars were seen driving towards them as they parked evenly together near the working tent. The lady waved at the cars, then turned to us. With a smile that stretched wider than ever, she asked, "Would you care to join us? It will only be 2 days." The soldiers hesitated. They didn't understand what she was talking about. How could they possibly join her when they were training? But Francis didn't listen because he could detect the presence that stood next to him. It was Julian. Hurricampa. The lady chirped at the confused but intrigued faces that peered back at her. They desired whatever this lady was offering. Some stepped forward with pride, hoping that whatever they were feeling would go away soon enough. Whatever was going on in this training facility wasn't correct, and Francis wanted to know why. He strode forward, but a tough hand tightened around his arm, the nails digging into Francis as he turned around with a stoic expression plastered across his dull face. "Are you sure you want to go with them?" Julian shot firmly. Francis could see the arrogance that he previously witnessed before fade into a mixture of trepidation that coursed through his body. "Yeah, why not?" Francis replied bluntly, not a single emotion in his tone of voice. Julian's voice dropped to a whisper, sharp and urgent. "Look, I know more about this than you think. I'm serious." Francis frowned, glancing toward the sergeant, who was deep in conversation with a woman near the waiting cars. Soldiers silently climbed into the vehicles, their faces blank and unreadable. "What are you even talking about?" Francis asked, his voice tense. Julian's grip tightened on Francis's arm. "You don't get it. These people, this company, they're not good. Do you even know what they're doing here?" "What do you know?" Francis shot back, trying to mask his frustration. Julian's gaze dropped, his expression heavy with guilt. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, Julian broke the silence. They're testing us. They push you to the edge just to see how you'll react, how your mind holds up under pressure. They monitor everything. What makes you falter? How you keep going when everything inside you says to stop. Francis stared at him, struggling to process the words. How do you even know all this? I can't explain right now. Julian's eyes darted to the cars and then back to Francis. We need to leave before it's too late. Before Francis could respond, a voice called out, Francis Everson and Julian Parker, please join us. It will be an honor to have such brilliant men among us. Cornell Walters stood with a bright smile, arms outstretched as if welcoming guests to a celebration. Francis glanced at Julian uneasily, but then something changed in his expression. You don't understand, Francis said softly. Grief, real grief, never lets go. I lost a child, Julian. I've watched it eat away at Doris every single day. If there's a way to end this, any of it, I have to try. Julian's face paled. You're making a mistake. Francis didn't reply. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather book, pressing it into Julian's hands. Take this to Doris. Tell her I'll be back soon. Julian's hands trembled as he took the book, his grip tight and uncertain. Francis turned without another word, walking toward one of the cars. He climbed inside, and the door closed with a dull final thud. Julian stood frozen, watching helplessly as the line of vehicles rolled forward. The black metal gate opened, the cars passed through, and then the gate shut once again. Gone. The silence that followed felt suffocating, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind. Where did they go? Someone whispered, their voice barely audible. Julian didn't answer, his fists clenched, his shoulders shaking with frustration. There's more to this story, he muttered under his breath, his voice low and strained. So much more. I'm sure that everyone remembers this. But when I was a child, I was always told to not give in to peer pressure. If anyone is offering you drugs or pretty much anything that you didn't want to do, you just firmly but kindly say no. I never gave it much thought because I was always good at making boundaries with people. My dad taught me that. However, for some reason I never thought that peer pressure existed in the adult world. Most of the people I was around that would offer things like weed or something to me when I was at work would only ask once, and after I said no, they would just leave me alone. Hell, I'm even friends with one of those guys. This utter incompetence is what got me into the situation I'm going to tell you about. One day while I was at work, a coworker of mine, Adam, had invited me over to his place for drinks and pizza. I had asked him why, since we didn't know each other that much, and he told me that I seemed like a cool person and he wanted to be friends. I eventually relented, and I met him at 7 after work. The night was what you would think. Music, funny YouTube videos, pizza, alcohol. As the night died down, we had pretty much cemented ourselves as best friends. At one point I asked to use the bathroom. He told me to walk down the hall, and it's the door on the right. I must have been incredibly drunk because I forgot which was my right and which was my left. I opened the door on the left. When I opened it, I was hit with the most incredible smell. Lilac, roses, tulips, and fresh grass filled the air. And although I smelled them all at once, they were still distinctly different. Completely forgetting I needed to piss, I yelled at Adam, "Yo, what the hell is this room?" Adam jumped up quite quickly and said in an eager voice, "Oh yeah, that's my plant room. I sit in there whenever I need to unwind. It's fun. You should try it sometime." I was a little unnerved, but hey, everyone has their hobbies. I told him that I'd have to get some plants soon, and the night ended soon after. Not a lot happened for the next couple months. Adam and I worked day in and day out, dealing with unruly customers, unfair supervisors, and trying to balance our work and social lives. Whenever Adam and I would chill at his place, the conversations we had always ended up being about plants. I didn't mind though. because I was planning on getting a plant of my own. Adam and I had become such good friends that we both had keys to each other's apartments. So it didn't surprise me when he barged in one day and basically begged me to take this cruise with him. He told me about this cruise, the floating oasis, he called it. A massive yacht that would hold 100 people. It would sail across the Pacific to Japan and come back. The trip would take a month, and Adam had saved enough money to take me with him. I simply couldn't say no. The yacht was massive. White, gold, green, and orange blended effortlessly into a concoction I can only describe as vibrantly beautiful. Once everyone was on the ship, we departed the port of California and made our way west. About an hour later, after we were settled, Adam and I took to exploring the cruise and everything it offered. The pool was dyed a beautiful green, with plants outlining the perimeter. Everywhere you looked there were either vine-like plants or massive leaves that would tower you, looming above your head. I had never felt safer. A week into the voyage, the captain told everyone that they had to stop at an upcoming island, too. We were free to explore the island as long as we returned to the yacht in an hour. Jack, an enthusiastic explorer, was the first to jump at the chance to venture onto a random island in the middle of the ocean. Adam seemed to get along with him well, and though Jack occasionally came off as overly confident, he was good company. We set off the boat with a few others, immediately noticing the island's beauty. Thick trees and vines sprawled across the landscape, their greens and purples vibrant against the soft sand. The ocean stretched endlessly before us, shimmering under the golden sunlight. The air was warm, carrying the salty breeze and the sound of gentle waves against the shore. The water was a mesmerizing deep blue, gradually lightening to turquoise as it neared the beach. Jack dashed ahead into the tree line, bending down to examine the underside of a large rock. Adam and I followed while the rest of the group enjoyed the water a little further down the shore. "Can you help me lift this?" Jack asked Adam. Adam moved closer, his fingers digging beneath the rock. I joined them, and together, we used all our strength to roll the stone aside. Underneath it was a strange cycle, an intricate image of a sapling with large leaves, surrounded by 3 circles and mysterious markings. As we inspected it, the ground suddenly shook as if a powerful force were pounding beneath us. A shockwave hit, knocking me off my feet. When I looked up, I saw something massive in the distance, a stretch of tree bark and thick green leaves towering above the smaller trees. "Did you guys feel that?" A young woman approached us, looking panicked. She introduced herself as Julia. Adam was already on edge. "We need to leave now." Julia helped me up, and as I turned to face the ocean, I was stunned. The yacht was gone. The water stood still, not a ripple in sight. We were out on the water, far from the safety of land. The neon sign in the distance flickered, and the town we passed through felt almost abandoned. "Stephen, I've been out here countless times. It's safe, I promise," I said, trying to reassure my younger brother. Stephen hesitated, his mouth opening as if he wanted to argue. But then he quickly fell silent. His worry was clear, and it deepened when he spoke. "But this is where Samantha..." His voice trailed off, a mix of fear and sorrow filling his tone. I placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to comfort him. "Stephen, that was an accident. Everyone knows that." He nodded, though his unease didn't seem to fade. "All right, fine. We can wait a little longer," he said, his voice quiet and hesitant. I was annoyed, but I didn't want to push him, not after everything our family had been through. I climbed into the boat, bringing a splash of cold water with me. I shook myself off, partly to annoy Stephen, but mostly to dry off. He shot me a playful glare, but smiled in the end. "Thanks for taking me out here. It's been a while since we've done something together." I smiled back and patted him on the shoulder. "So, are we going to fish, or what?" We both grabbed fishing rods and prepared the bait. We cast our lines out, each of us on opposite sides of the boat to avoid tangling. The peaceful silence between us lingered for a while before Stephen spoke again. Do you ever think about her? He asked softly. I looked at him, not fully understanding at first. Samantha. Yeah, her. Stephen's voice cracked slightly. I think about her all the time. She was the one who taught me how to swim and how to drive the boat. I looked away, trying to hide the emotions creeping up inside. I think about her too. But listen, it's getting dark. Maybe we should. Suddenly, Stephen shouted, Hey, look. He pointed toward the water. I followed his gaze to see a small, dark shape floating in the water, completely still. It wasn't moving with the current at all, almost like it was being held in place. It's just a fish, I said, trying to dismiss his concern. Come on, we should pack up. But Stephen didn't budge. His eyes remained fixed on the object. Stephen, come on, let's go, I urged, frustration creeping into my voice. Still, Stephen stayed motionless, his gaze locked on the black shape in the water. I sighed in annoyance. I'm heading back to shore. You better reel in your line if you want to catch anything. Stephen's voice trembled. It's a girl, he whispered. She needs my help. Confused, I turned around to find Stephen standing. How had he moved without me noticing? My heart skipped a beat. He was leaning over the edge of the boat now, the water below completely still. Stephen, stop. There's something wrong here. Please, just let it go. I spun around, but when I looked back at him, he was gone. Vanished. No sound. No warning. My heart pounded in my chest. Shit. He must have fallen in. I rushed to the spot where he had been standing. What the hell? I peered over the edge, but there was no wake, no ripples, nothing. The water was as still as glass, unnaturally so. I leaned over further and finally saw it, the dark shape again, almost the size of a teenager. I knew what it was now. I saw a finger reaching up from the depths. Her hands were decayed, yet in some places, they looked almost untouched, still beautiful in a way. Her nails, though, were fresh. She had just gotten them done. Then her cold hands wrapped around my neck. I felt a chill wash over me and a surge of fear. Samantha, please, I whispered, barely able to breathe. Her cold, lifeless body emerged from the water, her beauty frozen in death. Samantha, it was an accident. I tried to explain, but I could already feel my life slipping away. We were out on the water, far from the safety of land. The neon sign in the distance flickered, and the town we passed through felt almost abandoned. Stephen, I've been out here countless times. It's safe, I promise, I said, trying to reassure my younger brother. Stephen hesitated, his mouth opening as if he wanted to argue, but then he quickly fell silent. His worry was clear, and it deepened when he spoke. But this is where Samantha, his voice trailed off, a mix of fear and sorrow filling his tone. I placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to comfort him. Stephen, that was an accident. Everyone knows that. He nodded, though his unease didn't seem to fade. All right, fine. We can wait a little longer, he said, his voice quiet and hesitant. I was annoyed, but I didn't want to push him, not after everything our family had been through. I climbed into the boat, bringing a splash of cold water with me. I shook myself off, partly to annoy Stephen, but mostly to dry off. He shot me a playful glare but smiled in the end. Thanks for taking me out here. It's been a while since we've done something together. I smiled back and patted him on the shoulder. So, are we going to fish, or what? We both grabbed fishing rods and prepared the bait. We cast our lines out, each of us on opposite sides of the boat to avoid tangling. The peaceful silence between us lingered for a while before Stephen spoke again. Do you ever think about her? He asked softly. I looked at him, not fully understanding at first. Samantha. Yeah, her. Stephen's voice cracked slightly. I think about her all the time. She was the one who taught me how to swim and how to drive the boat. I looked away, trying to hide the emotions creeping up inside. I think about her too. But listen, it's getting dark. Maybe we should. Suddenly, Stephen shouted. "Hey, look." He pointed toward the water. I followed his gaze to see a small dark shape floating in the water, completely still. It wasn't moving with the current at all, almost like it was being held in place. "It's just a fish," I said, trying to dismiss his concern. "Come on, we should pack up." But Stephen didn't budge. His eyes remained fixed on the object. "Stephen, come on, let's go," I urged, frustration creeping into my voice. Still, Stephen stayed motionless, his gaze locked on the black shape in the water. I sighed in annoyance. "I'm heading back to shore. You better reel in your line if you want to catch anything." Stephen's voice trembled. "It's a girl," he whispered. "She needs my help." Confused, I turned around to find Stephen standing. How had he moved without me noticing? My heart skipped a beat. He was leaning over the edge of the boat now, the water below completely still. "Stephen, stop. There's something wrong here. Please, just let it go." I spun around, but when I looked back at him, he was gone. Vanished. No sound. No warning. My heart pounded in my chest. Shit. He must have fallen in. I rushed to the spot where he had been standing. What the hell? I peered over the edge, but there was no wake, no ripples, nothing. The water was as still as glass, unnaturally so. I leaned over further and finally saw it. The dark shape again, almost the size of a teenager. I knew what it was now. I saw a finger reaching up from the depths. Her hands were decayed, yet in some places, they looked almost untouched, still beautiful in a way. Her nails, though, were fresh. She had just gotten them done. Then her cold hands wrapped around my neck. I felt a chill wash over me and a surge of fear. "Samantha, please," I whispered, barely able to breathe. Her cold, lifeless body emerged from the water, her beauty frozen in death. "Samantha, it was an accident." I tried to explain, but I could already feel my life slipping away. "So sorry. I didn't mean to." "God, please." I reach out to grab her, but feel nothing there. My vision becomes blurry and dark. I can't make any noise. My throat is closed, crushed by the weight of her unnatural strength. So this is what she felt on that day when I took her out here. The cold water hits my back with a solid slap, sending a sharp pain up and down my spine. The water has never felt this cold. The hold on my throat tightens. I can still see her, following me down. I almost feel sorry for her. Sorry for the pain I caused her those few years ago. We sink lower and lower, the light of the surface. The warmth fades away as I'm dragged deeper into the eternal darkness of the deep lake. Again I am alone. Unable to breathe, but still awake. I cannot move, but I see things pass. Schools of fish. The occasional fishing lure. I reach but cannot physically move. I am alone. Fishing with Uncle Frank. Fishing with Uncle Frank was always an event. The man knew every lake, river, and backwoods creek for miles, and he told stories that made you believe he fished them all since time began. But that trip to Blackwater Lake, our last fishing trip, was one I'll never forget. It started early, way before the sun even hinted at rising. Uncle Frank picked me up in his old Ford truck, its headlights barely cutting through the dense fog rolling off the hills. I'd heard of Blackwater Lake before. Everyone in town had. But no one talked about it in any detail. The stories were vague, whispered warnings, rumors of disappearances, and a tale or two about the lake being cursed. Uncle Frank just laughed when I brought it up. "Curses don't catch fish, kid. And Blackwater's got the biggest bass in the county," he said, flashing that grin of his that always seemed a little too wide. The road to the lake was rough, overgrown with weeds and potholes that rattled your bones when you hit them. By the time we arrived, the fog was so thick it seemed to swallow everything beyond a few feet. I couldn't even see the lake's surface, but I could hear it. The faint lap of water against the shore, rhythmic and hollow, like something breathing. Uncle Frank didn't seem bothered. He grabbed the cooler, our rods, and the tackle box and motioned for me to follow. "Come on, let's get out there before the fish wake up. We pushed a rickety old rowboat into the water and climbed in. The lake smelled off like mud and something metallic, and the further we rowed, the quieter the world became. No birds, no insects, nothing but the creak of the oars and the occasional splash as something unseen moved beneath the surface. About halfway across, Uncle Frank stopped rowing and stared at the water. "This is the spot," he said, his voice low. I didn't question him. He always knew where to find the best fishing holes, though something about the way he said it made the hair on my neck stand up. We cast our lines and waited. The fog seemed thicker out here, clinging to my skin like damp cobwebs. Time dragged on, and not a single bite. Uncle Frank just sat there, motionless, staring at the water. "You okay, Uncle Frank?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, without looking at me, he said, "Did I ever tell you about my first time out here?" I shook my head. "Caught the biggest bass of my life," he said, but there was no pride in his voice, just something cold and flat. Thing was nearly 3 feet long, strong enough to snap my line if I wasn't careful. Fought me for a good 20 minutes before I got it into the boat. "So sorry. I didn't mean to. God, please." I reach out to grab her but feel nothing there. My vision becomes blurry and dark. I can't make any noise. My throat is closed, crushed by the weight of her unnatural strength. So this is what she felt on that day when I took her out here. The cold water hits my back with a solid slap, sending a sharp pain up and down my spine. The water has never felt this cold. The hold on my throat tightens. I can still see her, following me down. I almost feel sorry for her. Sorry for the pain I caused her those few years ago. We sink lower and lower, the light of the surface. The warmth fades away as I'm dragged deeper into the eternal darkness of the deep lake. Again I am alone, unable to breathe but still awake. I cannot move, but I see things pass. Schools of fish, the occasional fishing lure. I reach but cannot physically move. I am alone. Fishing with Uncle Frank. Fishing with Uncle Frank was always an event. The man knew every lake, river, and backwoods creek for miles, and he told stories that made you believe he'd fished them all since time began. But that trip to Blackwater Lake, our last fishing trip, was one I'll never forget. It started early, way before the sun even hinted at rising. Uncle Frank picked me up in his old Ford truck, its headlights barely cutting through the dense fog rolling off the hills. I'd heard of Blackwater Lake before. Everyone in town had. But no one talked about it in any detail. The stories were vague. Whispered warnings, rumors of disappearances, and a tale or two about the lake being cursed. Uncle Frank just laughed when I brought it up. "Curses don't catch fish, kid. And Blackwater's got the biggest bass in the county," he said, flashing that grin of his that always seemed a little too wide. The road to the lake was rough, overgrown with weeds and potholes that rattled your bones when you hit them. By the time we arrived, the fog was so thick it seemed to swallow everything beyond a few feet. I couldn't even see the lake's surface, but I could hear it. The faint lap of water against the shore, rhythmic and hollow, like something breathing. Uncle Frank didn't seem bothered. He grabbed the cooler, our rods, and the tackle box and motioned for me to follow. "Come on, let's get out there before the fish wake up." We pushed a rickety old rowboat into the water and climbed in. The lake smelled off like mud and something metallic, and the further we rowed, the quieter the world became. No birds, no insects, nothing but the creak of the oars and the occasional splash as something unseen moved beneath the surface. About halfway across, Uncle Frank stopped rowing and stared at the water. "This is the spot," he said, his voice low. I didn't question him. He always knew where to find the best fishing holes, though something about the way he said it made the hair on my neck stand up. We cast our lines and waited. The fog seemed thicker out here, clinging to my skin like damp cobwebs. Time dragged on, and not a single bite. Uncle Frank just sat there, motionless, staring at the water. "You okay, "Uncle Frank?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then, without looking at me, he said, "Did I ever tell you about my first time out here?" I shook my head. "Caught the biggest bass of my life," he said, but there was no pride in his voice. Just something cold and flat. Thing was nearly 3 feet long, strong enough to snap my line if I wasn't careful. Fought me for a good 20 minutes before I got it into the boat. He paused, his eyes still locked on the water. But when I looked closer, I noticed something. Its eyes. They weren't right. Too big, too human. And its mouth. He trailed off, shaking his head. I laughed nervously. "You're messing with me." He finally looked at me then, his face pale and serious. "You think I'm joking?" Before I could respond, my line went taut. The rod bent sharply, and I nearly lost my grip. "Got one," I shouted, adrenaline surging. "Reel it in slow," Uncle Frank said, but his voice wasn't excited. It was tense, almost scared. Whatever was on the other end of my line was strong, jerking and pulling like it was trying to drag me into the water. I reeled as hard as I could, my arms burning, until finally something broke the surface. At first, I thought it was a fish, a massive black-scaled monster with jagged fins. But then I saw its face. It wasn't a face at all, not one that should exist on this earth. Its eyes were milky white, too large for its head, and its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. It let out a sound, a horrible wet gurgle that made my stomach churn. I screamed and dropped the rod. The thing vanished beneath the water, and Uncle Frank grabbed my arm. "We're leaving," he said, his voice shaking. I didn't argue. He rowed us back to shore faster than I thought possible, his hands white-knuckled on the oars. The fog seemed to close in around us, and more than once, I thought I saw something moving just beneath the surface, keeping pace with us. When we finally reached land, Uncle Frank didn't say a word. He hauled the boat up, threw our gear into the truck, and started the engine. I didn't ask questions. As we drove away, I glanced back at the lake. Through the fog, I thought I saw something standing on the shore, watching us. It was tall, thin, and its glowing white eyes burned into my memory. Uncle Frank never mentioned Blackwater Lake again, and neither did I. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about that thing in the water. And in those dreams, I'm back in the boat, my line going taut, and the fog closing in. Only this time, I don't make it back to shore. My cats are protecting me from something. It started with a letter and a deed. Uncle Elias, my mother's reclusive brother, had passed away under mysterious circumstances, leaving his sprawling house and the surrounding land to me. I hadn't seen him in nearly a decade, but my childhood memories of him were fond. He was eccentric but kind, his stories always a little too fantastical to be true, yet told with such conviction that I believed every word. When I was younger, I idolized him. As I got older, life took over, and we drifted apart. Now, standing in the doorway of his old house, I felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and unease. The house had the kind of presence that loomed over you, tall and weather-worn, with windows that seemed to watch. The surrounding land stretched endlessly, a mixture of untamed forest and rolling fields. It felt both inviting and isolating. Still, it was mine now, and I planned to make it my home. It felt too big and empty for just me, though, so I decided I'd adopt a cat for companionship. The shelter told me I could pick up my new friend in a week. Plenty of time to settle in. The first night in the house was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet where every creak of the floorboards sounds like a footstep. I chalked it up to my nerves and the age of the place. By the third night, though, I couldn't ignore the oddities. I'd hear faint whispers, just on the edge of comprehension, coming from empty rooms. Doors I knew I had closed would be slightly ajar. A cold draft seemed to follow me, though the windows were all sealed. Once, I found a light on in the basement, a light I was sure I hadn't turned on. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of something heavy scraping across the attic floor directly above my bed. I lay frozen, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling. Eventually, the noise stopped, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The following morning, I ventured up to the attic, but found nothing out of place. The thick layer of dust covering the old furniture and forgotten belongings was undisturbed. Whatever had made the noise left no trace. By the time the week was up, I was desperate for my new companion. When I finally brought home the little black cat, I named her Artemis. I felt a glimmer of hope. Her presence immediately made the house feel less oppressive. She was curious and bold, strutting through the rooms like she owned the place. That first night, she slept at the foot of my bed, and I felt safer than I had since I'd moved in. The strange occurrences didn't stop entirely, but they seemed less intense. The whispers were softer, the drafts less chilling. It was as if the house, or whatever was in it, was wary of Artemis. Intrigued, I started researching cats and the paranormal. I learned that in many cultures, cats are believed to have a spiritual connection, capable of warding off evil spirits and guiding the dead. It was a comforting thought, but it also raised a chilling question. Had something in this house been responsible for my uncle's death? One night, I decided to test a theory. I left Artemis in the living room and went upstairs to my bedroom. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the oppressive feeling returned, stronger than ever. The whispers were louder, more insistent, and I swore I could see a shadow moving in the corner of my eye. Panicked, I called for Artemis. She padded into the room, jumped onto the bed, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The whispers faded. The shadow disappeared. That's when I knew. Whatever was in this house couldn't touch me as long as Artemis was nearby. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. What if there was a moment she wasn't there? What if the spirit grew stronger? The solution seemed simple. More cats. I adopted another, a gray tabby I named Milo, and then another, a calico named Cleo. Each new addition seemed to strengthen the invisible barrier between me and the malevolent presence. Soon, the house was alive with the sound of purring and playful paws. My little army of feline guardians had transformed the oppressive mansion into something almost cozy. But the spirit didn't leave. Every night, as I lay in bed surrounded by my cats, I'd see it, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching. It never moved, never spoke, but its presence was undeniable. I could feel its hatred, its frustration. It wanted me gone, but it couldn't reach me. As the weeks turned to months, the cats became my life. I added more to the family. A Siamese named Oliver, a fluffy Maine Coon I called Willow, a scrappy little stray I found on the property, whom I named Ash. The list goes on. Each one brought a new layer of warmth and protection to the house. The spirit's presence became almost a routine. It was there every night, but it could do nothing but stare. Occasionally, I'd feel a pang of fear. What if I was wrong? What if it was biding its time? On those nights, I'd gather all the cats into my bedroom, their comforting purrs lulling me to sleep. They seemed to know, instinctively, when I needed them most. I'd wake up to find them all nestled around me, a fortress of fur and trust. One stormy night, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and for the first time in months, I felt truly vulnerable. I lit candles, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. The spirit's silhouette seemed larger that night, more defined. But Artemis jumped onto my lap, her green eyes meeting mine with an unspoken assurance. Milo and Cleo flanked her, and soon the others joined. Their presence banished the fear. Even now, as I write this, I can see it. The spirit stands in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the faint glow of the hallway light. It stares as it always does, but I'm not afraid. Artemis is curled up on my chest, purring softly. Milo is at my feet. Cleo, Willow, Oliver, and Ash are scattered around the room, their serene presence a shield I know will never falter. This house is mine, and as long as I have my cats, it always will be. There's a strange phenomenon in the town where my mother was raised. The solution seemed simple: more cats. I adopted another, a gray tabby I named Milo, and then another, a calico named Cleo. Each new addition seemed to strengthen the invisible barrier between me and the malevolent presence. Soon, the house was alive with the sound of purring and playful paws. My little army of feline guardians had transformed the oppressive mansion into something almost cozy. But the spirit didn't leave. Every night, as I lay in bed surrounded by my cats, I'd see it, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching. It never moved, never spoke, but its presence was undeniable. I could feel its hatred, its frustration. It wanted me gone, but it couldn't reach me. As the weeks turned to months, the cats became my life. I added more to the family. A Siamese named Oliver, a fluffy Maine Coon I called Willow, a scrappy little stray I found on the property, whom I named Ash. The list goes on. Each one brought a new layer of warmth and protection to the house. The spirit's presence became almost a routine. It was there every night, but it could do nothing but stare. Occasionally, I'd feel a pang of fear. What if I was wrong? What if it was biding its time? On those nights, I'd gather all the cats into my bedroom, their comforting purrs lulling me to sleep. They seemed to know, instinctively, when I needed them most. I'd wake up to find them all nestled around me, a fortress of fur and trust. One stormy night, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and for the first time in months, I felt truly vulnerable. I lit candles, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. The spirit's silhouette seemed larger that night, more defined. But Artemis jumped onto my lap, her green eyes meeting mine with an unspoken assurance. Milo and Cleo flanked her, and soon the others joined. Their presence banished the fear. Even now, as I write this, I can see it. The spirit stands in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the faint glow of the hallway light. It stares, as it always does, but I'm not afraid. Artemis is curled up on my chest, purring softly. Milo is at my feet. Cleo, Willow, Oliver, and Ash are scattered around the room. Their serene presence, a shield I know will never falter. This house is mine, and as long as I have my cats, it always will be. There's a strange phenomenon in the town where my mother was raised. From what I'm told, it happens most often on moonless nights, when the cool wind calms the blades of grass with a mother's touch. Every time it happens, the townsfolk gather at the edges of the field, holding their breath, eyes focusing ahead, muscles tensing in the subtle throes of anticipation. The tightening of lips, the clenching of jaws, the flexing of fingers. Those who are there when it starts say you can feel the shift, like a frog thrashing about in their stomachs. Then, slowly, it begins to happen. First, loose blades of grass rise gently from the field and hang, suspended, lingering, scattered through the night sky like green, earthy stars. Next come the fireflies in droves, swarms, spilling out from the darkness of the trees, as if they had a duty to light the field for the onlookers. Next come the creatures. Great deer with massive antlers step unflinchingly out from the wood. Slowly they lift. They bound through the night sky with effortless poise, illuminated in silhouette by the fireflies and perfectly star-studded sky. Birds enter the field, cardinals, blue jays, red-breasted robins, and take flight without so much as a ruffling of feathers. Squirrels swim effortlessly through the black. On some nights, a wolf pads casually among the prey he normally consumes. The prey shows no fear, and the wolf no hunger. The field drew the attention of the townsfolk the same way a black hole absorbs everything in its radius. The locals swear that the air seems filled with music when it happens, a haunting melody that seems to sound slightly different to everyone. The tailor says it sounds like the snare of a drum. The innkeeper swears it's a lute. The minister is certain that it is the drone of a church organ and heralds it as a miracle from God. The truth is, nobody knows how to explain the field. The religious claim it surely must be God. The atheists are convinced it is some sort of gravitational distortion, a wobble in the physics of the universe that we don't quite understand yet. The spiritual call it magic. Some simply think it is the earth, or Mother Nature, delighting in her creation. The one thing everybody agreed on, however, was the rules. Most everybody in the town agree upon these rules, and are eager to tell any out-of-town stranger that asks. Rule 1. The field keeps its own secret. Anybody trying to document the phenomena, whether it be photograph or even writing, will find themselves with blank paper and empty film. Rule 2. The field protects. Do not attempt to harm any creature within the field. Rule 3. No human can enter the field. As a direct result of rule number 1, most everybody outside the village who heard of the field thought all the townsfolk were touched in the head. Many were of the opinion that this was some sort of mass hysteria or hallucination. The more suspicious even thought witchcraft, some form of trickery. But each and every long-standing member of the village swears the truth, as did their grandparents, and even great-grandparents. Each tells the same story, reciting the same rules. In my belief, there are only two options. It is an extended, multi-generational hoax, or just maybe, hopefully, they're all telling the truth. Rule 2 was discovered long ago by the great-grandfather of the blacksmith, who got the idea to try and use the floating deer as target practice. As the story goes, he took careful aim with his musket, and when he pulled the trigger, the bullet shot forth until it reached the very edge of the field. It stopped dead in its path. For a brief moment, it merely hovered before shooting back the opposite way and passing clean through the man's skull, killing him instantaneously. The field protects. Do not try to harm the creatures of the field. Rule 3 is the most ambiguous of the 3 rules. Nobody who has entered the field has ever been visibly harmed. However, nobody who has entered the field has ever returned. The townsfolk describe the barrier of the field as a one-way door. They do not mourn those who go into the field, nor do they celebrate them. Any human that steps into the field will lift from the earth, same as all the other creatures. The difference is that the humans will never touch the ground again. While all the creatures of the field seem to have an innate sense of how to maneuver within it, humans seem to lack that instinct. They simply rise up into the black until they are one with the stars. Very few of the people have witnessed this phenomenon, but those who have described the people who enter the field as those with nothing to lose. The mother who had lost her child, the carpenter whose arm had been shredded by a saw blade, the husband mourning the premature death of his wife. They enter the field with the knowledge that they will never return, and once they enter, onlookers describe them as radiating a sense of wonder. They do not seem afraid as they lift from the grassy carpet. Their eyes reflect a kaleidoscope of color. The stress and sorrow in their faces melt away into a sense of awe, enchantment. Some swear that they can see their lips moving, as if those inside the field are talking or singing, but no noise escapes from the field except the aching sense of music that appears differently to everyone. My mother is gone now. I have nothing to lose anymore. She told me tales of the field when I was very young. I remember her sitting on her lap as she played piano, sometimes placing my tiny hands over hers and feeling her fingers, far more nimble than mine, depressing the keys to form melodies that tickled my ears with awe. I would ask her questions, as any child would, about what she was like as a child, what her mother was like, the grandmother I had never met. With her calm green eyes and a patient smile, she would speak of the field. She would speak of what the music sounded like to her, the gentle melody of a grand piano, and how she would hold her mother's hand as she watched the creatures fly in their beautiful, haunting dance through the darkness of the night sky. It was her opinion that the field was magic that we would never understand, a sort of beauty that we were lucky to watch, but could never truly be a part of. The field was nature. The field was mystery. The field was proof that no matter how far humans traveled, no matter the greatness of our technology and machines, there were parts of the earth we could simply never comprehend. I have known pain, love, grief, joy, anger, bewilderment. I have explored the world, and answered many of the questions I had as a small child. There is one question that remains. What is inside the field? I feel that my whole life has led to this moment, to this night. Tonight will be a new moon. The sky grows dark. A gentle breeze is blowing from the north. It rained yesterday, and the air still smells like fresh earth and mist. As the sun fades from the sky, we all begin to hear it. The music has started. For me, it sounds like a distant piano, playing a hauntingly familiar melody that I cannot quite place. I see the swarms of fireflies lighting up the field. The deer have begun to bound. The tales were all true. It seems like some sort of ethereal dance. The faint music swells, and a crescendo of fireflies and birds swarm in an arc of light and color through the night sky. The townsfolk gather in a crowd some length away from the field, but nobody seems to notice when I move forward. The field has an electric energy, a weight that calls to me, like a black hole sucking me in. My final question will soon be answered. I hesitantly reach a hand out to the field's edge, and as soon as my fingers touch the border, I feel the density of the field sucking me forward. My mind was made up for me as soon as I brushed the surface of the field. The music swells in my ears, loud and clear, but it is not just a piano anymore. It is also banjo, organ, flute, drums, filling my head and spirit with an indescribable energy. My feet leave the ground, and I begin to rise. The creatures are not simple forest animals any longer. The deer's eyes multiply, and their head splits in a vertical mouth, lined with razor teeth. Its tail elongates, covered in carapace-like protrusions, almost like a centipede has grown from where its stub used to be, curling and waving behind it with an eerie weightlessness. The fireflies are now large glowing balls of indiscriminate light in various colors. Red, blue, green, yellow, purple, a kaleidoscope of brilliant light illuminating the sky. The birds have sprouted multiple sets of wings, and they vibrate and thrum like those of a bee. They seem much bigger now, and their talons glint like the edge of a newly forged knife. There is a wolf tonight. It is the size of a great lion, with a silvery mane that looks wiry and almost sharp, like touching it will cut flesh. The pupils of its eyes are non-existent. What used to be eyes are gaping black holes. The wolf's head is turned in my direction. "Welcome," it says. A cicada-like buzzing fills my ears, drowning the music. I look down at the townsfolk. They look like fleshy puppets, their faces smooth and blank. Their human form appears alien to me now. Their bodies seem twisted and unnatural, like their bones were snapped into place, and their flesh was clumsily stapled on by a new artist. I continue to rise, staring hungrily at the creations. Around me, watching their glittering legs and carapaces twist effortlessly in the gravity-less sky. They are beautiful. After my father died, I found a logbook concealed in his hospice room that he could not have written. John Morrison was, and will always be, my North Star. Naturally, the pain wrought by his ceaseless and incremental deterioration over the last 5 years at the hands of his Alzheimer's dementia has been invariably devastating for my family, besides the raw agony of it all. And in keeping with the metaphor, the dimming of his light has often left me desperately lost and maddeningly aimless. With time, however, I found meaning through trying to live up to him and who he was. Chasing his memory has allowed me to harness that crushing pain for what it was and continues to be, a representation of what a monument of a man John Morrison truly was. If he wasn't worth remembering, his erasure wouldn't hurt nearly as much. A few weeks ago, John Morrison died. His death was the first and last mercy of his disease process. And while I feel some bittersweet relief that his fragmented consciousness can finally rest, I also find myself unnerved in equal measure. After his passing, I discovered a set of documents under the mattress of his hospice bed. Some sort of journal, or maybe logbook, is a better way to describe it. Even if you were to ignore the actual content of these documents, their very existence is a bit mystifying. First and foremost, My father could not speak a meaningful sentence for at least 6 months prior to his death, let alone write one. And yet, I find myself holding a series of articulately worded and precisely written journal entries in his handwriting, with his very distinctive narrative voice intact no less. Upon first inspection, my explanation for these documents was that they were old and that one of my other family members must have left it behind when they were visiting him one day. Why they would have effectively hidden said documents under his mattress, I do not know. But upon further evaluation, and to my bewilderment, I found evidence that these documents had absolutely been written recently. We moved John into this hospice facility half a year ago, and one peculiar quirk of this institution is the way they approach providing meals for their dying patients. Every morning at sunrise, the aides distribute menus detailing what is going to be available to eat throughout the day. I always found this a bit odd. People on death's door aren't known for their voracious appetite or distinct interest in a rotating set of meals prepared with the assistance of a few local grocery chains, but ultimately wholesome and humanizing. John Morrison had created this logbook in delicate blue ink on the back of these menus. However strange, I think I could reconcile and attribute finding incoherent scribbles on the back of loose-leaf paper menus, mysteriously sequestered under a mattress, to the inane wonders of a rapidly crystallizing brain. Incoherent scribbles are not what I have sitting in a disorderly stack to the left of my laptop as I type this. I am making this post to immortalize the transcripts of John Morrison's death logbook. In doing so, I find myself ruminating on the point and potential dangers of doing so. Morally, I think sharing what he recorded in the brief lucid moments before his inevitable curtain call may be self-centered. But I am finding my morals to be suspended by the continuing desperate search for guidance, a surrogate North Star to fill the vacuum created by the untoward loss of a great man. Although I recognize my actions here may only serve to accelerate some looming cataclysm. For these logs to make sense, I will need to provide a brief description of who John Morrison was. Socially, he was soft-spoken. Despite his innate understanding of humor, which usually goes hand in hand with extroversion. Throughout my childhood, however, his introversion evolved into overwhelming reclusiveness. I try not to hold it against him, as his monasticism was a byproduct of devotion to his work and his singular hobby. He paid the bills with a science background and found meaning through art. More specifically, he was a cellular biologist and an amateur oil painter. I think he found his fullness through the juxtaposition of biology and art. He once told me he felt that pursuing both disciplines with equal vigor would allow him to find their common endpoint, the elusive location where intellectualism and faith eventually merged and became indistinguishable from one another. I think he felt like that was enlightenment, even if he never explicitly said so. In his 9-to-5, he was a researcher at the cutting edge of what he described as cellular topography. Essentially, he was looking at characterizing the architecture of human cells at an extremely microscopic level. He would say, looking at a cell under a normal microscope is like looking at a map of America, a top-down, big-picture view. I'm looking at the cell like I'm one person walking through a small town in Kansas. I'm recording and documenting the peaks, the valleys, the ponds. I'm mapping the minute landmarks that characterize the boundless infinity of life. I will not pretend to even remotely grasp the implications of that statement. And this in spite of the fact that I too pursued a biologic career. So I have some background knowledge. I just rarely observe cells at a small town in Kansas level as a hospital pediatrician. As his life progressed, his dementia gradually impacted his career. He retired just as both the pandemic and my medical training began. I missed the early stages of it, but I heard from my sister that he initially took pride in his retirement, though that changed as he no longer remembered what his career had been. She compared it to sitting outside on a warm summer evening, as the day shifts from late afternoon to nightfall. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he lost the warmth of his passions until it was completely gone. His interest in painting followed a similar pattern. When he was home and awake, he was usually in his studio, working on his latest piece. He drew influence from many sources, but was particularly drawn to blending the objective beauty of Claude Monet with the abstract styles of Picasso. He often liked to merge opposites, but as his dementia progressed, this too faded. Because of this unique blending of styles, his art wasn't widely appreciated. It was often considered too chaotic and difficult to understand. Not that he cared to show or sell his work. He simply painted for himself. The only painting I clearly remember was of the oak tree in our backyard, with human-like veins visible beneath the bark. At 8 years old, I found it unsettling and never quite understood the meaning behind it. He never explained it to me, nor did he apologize for scaring me. Now, to get to the main point, I'll describe his first journal entry, or at least what I believe to be his first. The entries are dated, but none fall within the last 6 months of his life. In fact, they span over 2 decades. About a week after his passing, I called his hospice case manager to ask about the menus he had been given, but my request seemed confusing to her at the time. In retrospect, I can understand why. I then shared with her my discovery of the logbook, but she had no explanation for it. She did mention, however, that no one on his care team had seen him writing anything, and they were careful not to leave pens around because of the risk they posed to patients in the memory unit. John Morrison had kept journals throughout his life, though he was private about them, often disposing of his writings when he was finished. I don't remember when he started journaling, but I recall being shooed away whenever I saw him writing in his notebooks. In my youth, I resented this secrecy, but in the end, I've tried to let those feelings go. A side note, toward the end of his life, he meticulously drew some tables and figures that seemed to represent a long-lost scientific methodology. Despite his cognitive decline, these drawings reappeared in his final days, and I plan to scan and upload them as well. I plan to go through all the entries before posting this. A lot has happened in the weeks since his death, and I hope to provide some commentary to help interpret them. It may take time, though. One thing I've noticed is that all the entries use the same exact letterhead. Identical, perfectly reproduced every time. It's strange because, despite his declining state, John's hand seemed to regain remarkable dexterity in those final days. Even though when I visited, I had to help him with simple tasks like dressing and brushing his teeth. I should mention that I believe there's something crucial about this logbook, something I can't explain yet. The entries seem important, but their meaning eludes me at the moment. All I can say for now is that I believe John Morrison may have found his common endpoint. And whatever that is, it may cost us everything. Dated as April 2004. First translocation. The morning of the first translocation was like any other. I awoke around 9 a.m. Lucy was already out of bed and probably had been for some time. Peter and Lily had really become a handful over the last few years, and Lucy would need help giving Lily her medications. Wearily, I stood at the top of our banister, surveying the beautiful disaster that was raising young children. Legos strewn across every surface with reckless abandon. Stains of unknown origin. I am grateful, of course, but good Lord, the absolute devastation. I walked stealthily down the stairs, avoiding perceived creaking floorboards as if they were landmines, hoping to sneak out the front door and get a deep breath of fresh air prior to joining my wife in the kitchen. Unfortunately, Lucy had been gifted with incredible spatial awareness. With a single aberrant footstep, a whisper of a creaking floorboard betrayed me, and I felt Lucy peer sharp daggers into me. Her echolocation, as always, was unparalleled. "Oh look, Dad's awake," Lucy proclaimed with a smirk. She had doomed me with less than 5 words. I heard Lily and Peter dropping silverware in an excited frenzy. "Touche, love," I replied with resignation. I hugged each of them good morning as they came barreling towards me, and returned them to the syrup-ridden battlefield that was our kitchen table. Peter was 6. Bleach blonde hair, a swath of freckles covering the bridge of his nose. He's a kind, introspective soul, I think. A revolving door of atypical childhood interests, though, ghosts and mini-golf as of late. Lily was 3, a complete and utter contrast to Peter, which we initially welcomed with open arms. Gregarious and frenetic, already showing interest in sports, not things my son found value in. The only difference we did not treasure was her health. Peter was perfectly healthy, but Lily was found to have a kidney tumor that needed to be surgically excised a year ago, along with her kidney. Lucy, as always, stood slender and radiant in the morning light, attending to some dishes over the sink. We met when we were both 18 and had grown up together. When I remembered to, I let her know she was my kaleidoscope. Looking through her, the bleak world could appear beautiful. It could maybe even have meaning, if I looked long enough. After setting the kids at the table, I helped her with the dishes, and we talked a bit about work. I had taken the position at CellCept 2 weeks ago. The hours were grueling, but the pay was triple what I was earning at my previous job. Lily's chemotherapy was more important than my sanity. Lucy and I had both agreed on this fact, with a half shit-eating, half-earnest grin on the day I signed my contract. Thankfully, I had been scouted alongside a colleague, Marjorie. Marjorie was 15 years my junior, a true savant in the field of cellular biology. It was an honor to work alongside her, even on the days it made me question my own validity as a scientist. Perhaps more importantly, though, Lucy and she were close friends. Lucy and I discussed the transition, finances, and other topics quietly for a few minutes, until she said something that gave me pause. "How are you feeling? Beyond the exhaustion, I mean." I set the plate I was scrubbing down. Unsure of what she was getting at, I gave a very non-committal answer. "I'm okay. Hanging in best I can." She scrunched her nose to that response, an immediate and damning physiologic indicator that I had not given her an answer that was close enough to what she was fishing for. "You sure you're doing okay?" "Yeah, I am," I replied. She put her head down. In conjunction with the scrunched nose, I could tell her frustration was rising. "John, you just started a new medication, and the seizure wasn't that long ago. I know you want to be stoic and all that, but..." I turned to her, incredulous. I had never had a seizure before in my life, and I take a few Tylenol here and there, but otherwise I wasn't on any medication. "Lucy, what are you talking about?" She kept her head down. No response. "Lucy." I put a hand on her shoulder. "This is where I think the translocation starts, or maybe a few seconds ago, when she asked about the seizure." In a fleeting moment, all the ambient noise evaporated from our kitchen. I could no longer hear the kids babbling, the water splashing off dishes, the birds singing distantly outside the kitchen window. As the word Lucy fell out of my mouth, it unnaturally filled all of that empty space. I practically startled myself. It felt like I had essentially shouted in my own ear. Lucy and the kids were caught and fixed in a single motion, statuesque and uncanny. Lucy with her head down at the sink, Lily sitting up straight and gazing outside the window with curiosity. Peter was the only one turned towards me, both hands on the edge of his chair with his torso tilted forward, suspended in the animation of getting up from the kitchen table. As I stepped towards Lucy, I noticed that Peter's eyes would follow my position in the room, unblinking. No movement from any other part of his body to accompany his eyes tracking me. Then, at some point, I noticed a change in my peripheral vision to the right of where I was standing. The blackness may have just blinked into existence, or it may have crept in slowly as I was preoccupied with the silence and my newly catatonic family. I turned cautiously, something primal in me trying to avoid greeting the waiting abyss. Where my living room used to stand, there now stood an empty room bathed in fluorescent light from an unclear source, sickly yellow rays reflecting off of an alien tile floor. There were no walls to this room. At a certain point, the tile flooring transitioned into inky darkness in every direction. In the middle of the room, there was a man on a bench, watching me turn towards him. With my vision enveloped by these new Stygian surroundings, a cacophonous deluge of sound returned to me. Every plausible sound ever experienced by humanity, present and accounted for. Laughing, crying, screaming, shouting. Machines and music and nature. An insurmountable and uninterruptible wave of force. At the threshold of my insanity, the man in the center stepped up from the bench. He was holding both arms out, palms faced upwards. His skin was taut and tented on both of his wrists, tired flesh rising about a foot symmetrically above each hand. Dried blood streaks led up to a center point of the stretched skin, where a fountain of mercurial silver erupted upwards. Following the silver with my eyes, I could see it divided into thousands of threads, each with slightly different angular trajectories, all moving heaven-bound into the void that replaced my living room ceiling. With the small motion of bringing both of his hands slightly forward and towards me, the cacophony ceased in an instant. I then began to appreciate the figure before me. He stood at least 10 feet tall. His arms and legs were the same proportions, which gave his upper extremities an unnatural length. His face, however, devoured my attention. The skin was a deep red, consistent with physical strain, and it was glistening with sweat. He wore a tiny smile, the sides of his lips barely rising up to make a smile recognizable. His unblinking eyes, however, were unbearably discordant with that smile. In my life, I have seen extremes of both physical and mental pain. I have seen the eyes of someone who splintered their femur in a hiking accident, bulging with agony. I have seen the eyes of a mother whose child was stillborn, wild with melancholy. The pain, the absolute oblivion. In this figure's eyes easily surpassed the existential discomfort of both of those memories. And with those eyes squarely fixated on my own, I found myself somewhere else. My consciousness returned to its set point in a hospital bed. There was a young man beside me, holding my hand. Couldn't have been over 14. I retracted my hand out of his grip with significant force. The boy slid back in his chair, clearly startled by my sudden movement. Before I could ask him what was going on, Lucy jogged into the room, her work stilettos clacking on the wooden floor. I pleaded with her to get this stranger out of here, to explain what was happening, to give me something concrete to anchor myself to. With a sense of urgency, Lucy said, "Peter, honey, could you go get your uncle from the waiting room and give your father and me a moment?" The hospital's neurologist explained I suffered a grand mal seizure while at home. She also explained that all the testing so far did not show an obvious reason for the seizure, like a tumor or stroke. Though more tests loomed, she sold us her belief that all would be well. We talked about the visions I had experienced, which she chalked up to an atypical aura, or a sudden and unusual sensation that can sometimes precede a seizure. Lucy and I spoke for a few minutes while Peter retrieved his uncle. As she recounted our lives, home address, current work struggles, etc., I slowly found memories of Lily's 8th birthday party, Peter's first day of middle school, Lucy and I taking a trip to Bermuda to celebrate my promotion at Celcept. When Peter returned with his uncle, I recognized him as my son. Initially, I was satisfied with the explanation given to me for my visions. Confusion and disorientation after seizures is a common phenomenon, known as a post-ictal state. It all gave me hope. That false hope endured only until my next translocation, prompting me to document my experiences. End of entry 1. John was actually a year off. I was 15 when he had his first seizure. Date-wise, he is correct, though he first received his late-onset epilepsy diagnosis in April 2004, right after my mother's birthday that year. The memory he is initially recalled, if it is real, would have happened in 1995. I apologize, but I am exhausted and will need to stop transcription here for now. I will upload again when I am able. Peter Morrison. To the man who hid beneath my floorboards, I never want to see you again. I live in a modest apartment on the top floor of an old building, with nothing above me but a dusty attic. When I moved in, I thought I was finally escaping the chaos of my old shared place. The neighborhood was quiet, my neighbors kept their distance, and the attic overhead felt reassuring, like a buffer between me and the night sky. I first noticed something strange one evening as I was drifting off to sleep. In the silence, I heard cautious footsteps directly above my ceiling. The attic was supposed to be sealed off, so I told myself it was probably rats, maybe a stray cat. But the next night, at the exact same time, the footsteps returned. Soft creaks, the sound of fabric brushing against wood, like a body trying to move silently. Feeling uneasy, I questioned my landlord. He insisted, "No one has accessed that attic for years. It's locked and empty. Probably just the old wood settling." I wasn't convinced. I propped a chair under the attic hatch. It was secured with a heavy, rusted padlock. Yet the following night, I woke to a gentle groan of hinges. The hatch had shifted. The padlock still hung there, but slightly angled, as if it had been opened and carefully put back. My heart hammered so violently I felt dizzy. The next morning, I bought a small camera and positioned it high on a wardrobe, aiming it at the hatch. That night, the noises came again, subtle and measured. At sunrise, I replayed the footage with trembling hands. The hatch lifted a fraction. A pale, grimy hand emerged through the crack, groping in the darkness as if searching. Not an animal's paw, this was unmistakably human. Someone was up there, suspended in eerie silence, watching me sleep below. I called the police immediately. They promised to send a patrol and urged me to leave the apartment. But it was late, and the idea of stepping into the night felt worse. I grabbed a kitchen knife, barricaded my door, and sat on my bed, trembling and listening. Around 3 a.m., I heard a scratching sound, this time beneath my bed. My blood turned to ice. The attic was above, not below. How could anyone be under my floorboards? I pressed my ear to the wood. The sound repeated. Something was crawling, slithering in a space that shouldn't exist. I remembered reading that the building once had another level that was later sealed off. Could there be a hidden crawl space, just large enough for a desperate, deranged person to nest in? I wanted to run, but fear held me in place. Suddenly, the noises crept toward my front door. I heard it strain and creak as something tried to force it open. I dialed emergency services, voice shaking, pleading for help. They said the patrol was close, told me to stay calm. Then the pounding on the door stopped. Silence. Agonizing minutes passed until the police arrived. They searched my apartment thoroughly. Nothing. The hatches were closed, no sign of a break-in. I was half crazed, begging them to check the attic. Finally, they forced the lock. Inside, they found old boxes, scraps of food, a filthy blanket, and my name carved into a beam. Tacked to a wall were candid photos of me taken from outside my own building at different hours. The officers looked unnerved. They found no alternate exits, no tunnels. Just a cramped space that reeked of stale sweat and something sinister. I fled that same morning to a friend's place. The next day, I returned briefly for my belongings. In my mailbox was an unmarked envelope. Inside was a single Polaroid, me standing in my living room the night before, talking to the police. The photo had been taken from inside my apartment. Somehow, he had outsmarted me, eluded the authorities, and watched me from every angle, above, below, through walls I once thought solid. I'll never know how he slipped in and out unseen, never learn his name. But to the man who lurked beneath my floorboards and in my attic, if you ever read this, know that I would rather lose my mind than ever meet you face to face. Don't ever come back. Not ever. Just scan this old Polaroid I found in a box after everything that happened. The quality's rough, but it's what I had. Thought I'd share it since some of you were curious. The staircase. My name is Amanita, and I am 17 years old. Before you say anything, I know it's a bad name. It wasn't my choice, but it is my name. My parents are of the interesting sort, always in some form of plight, or in a fight with each other, and I hide in my room, without the light, but never sleep through the night. I live in a perfectly normal house, 2 floors, 3 bedrooms, but one is an office, 2 bathrooms, but one is only half, and a mildewing basement with the most egregious gray carpeted floor. I go to school every day, except of course on Saturday and Sunday, and every day the bus takes the same path. I wake up at 7 each morning, no earlier and no later, for the most to avoid begrudged moaning from my parents, but there is some sense of comfort in the uniformity of every day. The bus always takes the same path. It begins at a school close to my house and take about 20 minutes to bring us to school. Most of the time it takes the same route, never driving by the pool or the officious drool of a homeless school that always begged on 9 Mile Road. Instead, we always drive past the fast food restaurants, the Kroger stores, and the small Middle Eastern markets. One time, I remember my grandpa, who is one of the most interesting men you will ever meet, told me that whenever you go past a cemetery, you should hold your breath, else ghosts would make you a new host to their pearly folks' gaseous flow. My favorite part of the impartial drive is passing the cemetery, with its green-spun holly and blood-soaked flowers, the cracked gravestones that burn black with void, and the silver-gray fence that is a brutalist message to stay out. Living in Detroit, there is a form of community that one can't find anywhere else. We all hate it here, but there is nowhere else we would rather be. I can think of being in the swim team locker room. Someone's cap goes missing, and it's almost unanimous to all of us. Can't have shit in Detroit. And we all nod in indignant interest that intercepts the boundaries between hate and home. I don't much like talking about school, so I won't. What I will talk more about is the bus ride home. A cemetery looks so different in the afternoon. The mists that dip drearily over the dew-raised grass drops away, leaving a new vibrant ground of lime-colored greens and sticks that poke gently out of the ground. Even though it is so different, I'm not entirely sure which I prefer. I always daydream that maybe one day some kind of imp or impish animal is crawling around, or a long-haunted spirit is floating softly with their misty skin thaw. I will not acknowledge the oddity of my favorite part of my day is driving past a cemetery. You can call me weird or abnormal, but I don't really care. Think of all the dumb things that make you happy and revel in the joy of there being so many, because I just have one. Eventually, I arrive at a swim practice, which again I find comfort in the conformity, every day after school for 3 hours. Sometimes I work, sometimes I just go home. And when I get home, I work on homework for a few hours, study for the rest, and sleep until the next morning, where I wake up at precisely 7, and you know the rest. Often, I find my friends asking me what my music taste is, or who I listen to, and I'll give the answer they want. Whatever rapper is popular, though I don't hate rap. I even listen to it often, I would say. It's far from my favorite. It's just easier than saying I listen to Neutral Milk Hotel or Fountains of Wayne. And then they say, "Who's that?" And I say, "Oh, it's just a folk band." Or they do power pop, and they chuckle a little to break the awkwardness, and the conversation moves on. When I have time, I'll play on my computer with my friends, but not always. Sometimes I'll just sit and stare at my screen. I don't know what I'm looking for, but one day I'll find it, and on that day I'll be unstoppable. I like to cook, and I'm pretty good at it. In fact, I would even go as far as to say I might be one of the best 17-year-old cooks, at least in the US. Call that cockiness, or honestly call it whatever you want. If you are a 17-year-old cook in the US, I'm better than you, and you just must deal with that. I also play too many instruments, and to be honest, I don't even know where I find the time to practice. Still, I'm first chair trumpet, a damn good double bass player, and an absolutely dogshit guitarist. But none of this really matters, does it? You can know as much as you want about me, but you still won't know me. To be honest, if you knew me in real life, I'm not sure we'd get along. Many of my friends do, but you're not my friend. You don't know me, and I want you to keep that in mind. Honestly, I probably wouldn't like you either. There are very few people I genuinely like, even among my friends and family. I'm not religious, but I believe in ghosts. It's a strange contradiction. but it's how I feel. If you're wondering what ghosts are, I honestly couldn't give you a clear answer. Sometimes it's just easier to accept things as they are without overthinking it. Most of my family is religious, but I think that word only scratches the surface of what's really going on. No one in my family is truly okay, and we've all learned to live with that. I'm sharing all of this because I think it's important for someone, whoever you are, to remember me. Legacy is all we have when we die, and when no one remembers us, it feels like dying in more ways than one. I've already told you I don't believe in an afterlife, so legacy is what I hold on to. I apologize for the change in tone. When I said our house was perfectly normal, that wasn't entirely accurate. There is one feature that stands out: the staircase leading to our basement. It's a spiral staircase made of dark stained oak, connected to our kitchen. The grain in the wood has dark streaks, and the varnish sometimes comes off, revealing the sticky residue that feels oddly satisfying to touch. The wood is left bare, and over time, bits of cat hair accumulate in the crevices, sometimes mixed with stray pieces of dog food. You can often hear the crunching sound when walking down the stairs. Today is December 5th, a Thursday. I just got home from swim practice, and I'm not doing well. To be honest, I've been struggling for the past few weeks. I've been experiencing hallucinations, but not in the way you might think. They're different from what you'd expect. Worse, it started off exactly 2 weeks ago. It was morning and I was riding the bus to school. As normal, we passed by the cemetery, and as normal I had some music on while solemnly staring at the silent and sterile cemetery. The mist sat low and rolled like clouds, softly stepping over each grave. The dirt seemed to almost be alive, slightly moving with what I guess was every little slip of wind. The grass stood still and tall, yet it still flowed softly, with a few taller blades that had been missed by the groundskeeper. We were almost past when I saw her. She was a pale woman, almost as pale as the mist that swirled near her feet. Her skin seemed to almost shine as small rays of sun began sneaking over the skyline. Her eyes were wide-eyed, almost frantic, but she was completely still. Her hair didn't even move with the wind, but instead laid completely still, long and black, but stained gray and brown with twigs and all sorts of small things poking out. It seemed frail and shaggy, like it could be pulled out with gentle tugs. She was very skinny. You could see the bones in her lanky arms and the ribs pressing against her slightly translucent dress. Strangely, her skin seemed too perfect, like she had polished them with sandpaper. She was standing perfectly still with her head pointed slightly down, as she was staring at a grave. Just as we were about to drive past, her face jerked and pointed directly towards me. Her face seemed almost hollow, like there was nothing behind her eyes. Her mouth opened to a jet-black abyss that seemed to be infinitely deep. Just as we had almost passed, she started screaming. Her voice was shrill, and so high-pitched I could barely hear her. It was full of cracks, and all I could make out were 2 words: "Find me, please." And we drove past. I frantically looked around the bus. No one else was looking up, glued to a phone or homework that they forgot to get done for their first hour. The whole school day felt like it lasted forever. I told my parents I had a school event. That was a lie. Instead, after school, I walked the mile to the cemetery. The black gates that seemed like they would be guarding something horrible were unlocked. Their spikes imposed down on me and seemed to grow taller as I stared. Though the day started off sunny, as it passed the sky became covered with dark clouds, the kind before a dreadful thunderstorm. I pushed lightly, and it seemed the gates swung open on their own. I slowly walked through the graveyard, as I had at least an hour and a half before my parents would be expecting me at school. Most of the graves were too old and dust-crusted to see the names or dates, but I caught a couple here and there, though no names of note. I wasn't alone in the cemetery. A few old women locked, perhaps widows remembering their husbands, or mothers who lost their children. Eventually I arrived at the grave she was staring at. It was close to the fence, and shadows from the fence cast it down, even though there was no sun shining. I walked around the grave, kicked lightly at the dirt, and eventually I sat down for a second when I finally realized I wasn't going to be able to read the grave, as it wasn't just dirt, but the name was seemingly scratched off. After a minute or so of desperately hoping something on the grave would be visible, I sat down and held my knees to my chest, staring at the grave. I began to wonder if it was just a weird dream. But I don't remember waking up, and it just seemed so vividly real. When I sat down, I realized there was something I missed. Covered in dirt and a tuft of grass was a small piece of paper. When I grabbed it and dusted it off, I realized it was yellowed and crinkled as if it was very old. The note read, "Help me, help 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 me. I found you. Did you find me? Did you find me? Did you find me? Did you find me?" It was at this point I began to wonder if someone had put this as a prank. At least I did until the note completely crumbled to dust in my hands and blew away, and in the whisper of the winds, I heard one last time, "I found you." I walked back to school silently and without music. Slowly, as I walked to the parking lot of the school, the skies seemed to clear. At the time I didn't know, but that was for one of the last times I would see the sky. I was waiting on a bench in the school parking lot for a few minutes when my brother, whose name is Paniolus, I know our parents are really bad with names, picked me up in his dark gray Civic. We drove home quietly. I think he knew something was off. To be entirely honest, I think he noticed more than I did. When I got home, I was greeted by one very excited dog, two cats who kept their distance because of said dog. I immediately went up to my room and laid down. I had homework to do, but the chance of me doing that was slim to none. After dinner, I fell asleep as for some reason this wave of exhaustion had rolled over me. The next morning when I got up and looked out my window, it was very dark, but I could still tell those dark clouds hung heavy over the sky. As I walked to the bathroom, I walked up to the toilet, and without warning, I began throwing up. I noticed I was being rather loud and wasn't surprised to find a gentle hand laid on my back. I kept throwing up and retching for at least another couple minutes, and when I stood up and turned around, I saw that same woman staring at me. All I remember is she started shrieking once again. That's the last thing I remember before I woke up in a cold shiver in my bed. My forehead was sweating, and I felt like death. My brother noticed I had woken up from the room over, and came over to hand me a glass of warm water and scanned my temperature. 102. "You need to rest." He spoke. "Tell us if you need to go to the bathroom. We don't want you fainting and hitting your head without us noticing." And I nodded slowly, agreeing with him. He then asked me, "How did it happen you got a giant clump of your hair in the toilet?" And I sat for a second, not knowing what to tell him as I don't remember anything involving my hair. And in fact my hair was the only part of me that seemed okay. The rest of the day passed slowly. My fever never went down, and I suppose I needed some rest anyway. Every time I looked around, she would appear for just a second in the corner of my eye before disappearing. Due to my fever, I would occasionally fall asleep, only to wake up again. In the second after I would wake up, I could faintly hear her voice saying, "I found you." The next morning, I was supposed to have work. My fever had gone down to 99 overnight, and I felt much better, but I work with kids, and it would break my heart if I was the reason any of them got sick. My boss was surprisingly understanding, and said she would find someone to sub for me. My computer is set up in the basement. It's cold, dark, and miserable, which is exactly why I like it. I was playing some single-player games, but the whole time, I felt this sense of unease, which wouldn't go away no matter what I did to distract myself. Eventually, I fell asleep in my computer chair and must have slept for a couple of hours. When I woke up, everything felt off. It was as if I wasn't home. The rooms were arranged differently. The staircase was much grander, and even my computer had changed. Everything was just not right. I got up and walked around the basement for a little while. Every little detail seemed altered, even the shirt I was wearing. I walked upstairs to try to make sense of it all, and found my mother cooking. She stared at me, and something still felt off. When she saw me, she seemed shocked. "Amanita, what are you doing? You should be in bed. Your fever." I replied with a dismissive, "I feel fine." But she insisted on checking my temperature. It was 102.5. It had gone up. She led me by the hand to my room and sat me down, telling me to stay in bed or she would make sure I did. I asked where Paniolus was, but she just looked at me, confused, and told me to go to sleep. I must have slept through the rest of the day. When I woke up, it was Sunday morning, or at least it should have been. My phone read December 3rd, 8:41 a.m. I didn't remember it ever being December. It should have been November. At this point, I began to wonder if my situation was worse than I had thought. The woman was still there, but now she stayed. When I looked at her, she shrieked, or screamed, or whatever it was she was doing. I noticed now she was holding a pen and paper, but she wasn't writing anything. The paper just sat limply at her side. My door was closed, and as I got up to open it, it felt as though my body was being pulled back to the ground. I almost got to the door before I fell to the carpet, landing on my arm. Though I thought the fall was loud, no one came to check on me, except for the woman. She came over and helped me up, her bony hands digging into my flesh. But at this point, I was too delirious to care. She pushed me back into bed and disappeared again. I think I fell asleep, but I'm not entirely sure. Eventually, I heard a knocking on my door. 3 short, deep knocks that seemed to rattle the entire house. Then, 3 more knocks, this time more insistent, almost like they had a hunger to them. I curled deeper into my bed, unsure of what would happen next. Burying my face in my blankets, tears began streaming down and reddening my eyes. After a minute, the knocking started again, but it was constant. I saw my door shake, but there were no shadow out from under it, despite the light pouring in from underneath. When the knocking stopped, I lay perfectly still and stared at my ceiling. I'm not sure how long I looked, but I remember seeing these weird arms, thin and lanky, almost like spiders' legs. They would flicker back and forth across my ceiling like spaghetti noodles falling from a fork. When my attention finally broke, I looked to my side and was surprised to see my brother staring back. Something was different. Then I realized it was the same look my mom had earlier, and the woman, who now stood perfectly still in the corner of my room. Their eyes were so hollow. Their skin was taut against their bones, and their hair fell in a tangled mess. I blinked, and he vanished. I looked at my phone, and it read December 3rd, 8:41 p.m. 12 hours had passed in what felt like minutes. Suddenly, I heard a scream from outside my door. I don't know why, but something about it was so calling to me. I got out of bed, this time without the dizziness or the weight of my body stopping me, and I opened my door. Looking back at me, I saw my mother. My father had her pinned against the wall by her neck with one hand and a pair of pliers in the other hand. It didn't take me too long to realize that he was slowly pulling out one tooth at a time. Each time more blood rushed out of her mouth, and she would scream louder and louder. On each tooth I could see the sinew and meat dangling off. Blood dripped onto the floor, and she smiled. She smiled. I woke up once again in my bed, but it was like I never even left. I looked at my phone again, and it read 8:42 p.m. The date didn't show, or my vision was too blurry to see it. Not 5 minutes later. It could have been much longer or shorter. My sense of time was near non-existent by now. I fell asleep. When I woke up again, I was feeling slightly better. The knocking was back now, but it sounded like it was coming from everywhere around me. I saw massive spiders crawling across the wall and ceiling. Their furry abdominals seemed to wiggle and change shape as I looked at them. They would crawl for a little bit, and then they would disappear, but they would disappear. Instead, I could see the same spider a few feet away, crawling in a different direction. At one point, I remember my dad coming into my room. He opened my doorway and stared at me. Eventually, I watched as his eyes started to melt in their sockets, the white cornea liquefied and splashing on my carpet before soaking in. His face seemed to be constantly changing shape, but it always looked like him. Suddenly, he brought his hand up to show me, his palm facing him. With his other hand, he dug in and began ripping his fingernails out one by one. The noise was the worst part. It would make this squelching noise like a sponge being squeezed. I could see the blood pouring out of the now exposed skin, and he held all 5 fingernails in his other hand. He brought them up to his abyss-like mouth and swallowed them like pills. This time, he walked out and closed the door. I don't remember waking up. The woman finally came over to me and talked. She handed me her pad of paper and pressed with the pencil against my chest. She said, "Write," and I asked, "Write what?" And she disappeared, but she left the pen and the paper. I fell asleep one last time. And when I woke up, my phone said 10:54 p.m., December 5th. Today, I saw my door creak open, and the woman beckoned me to follow. For some reason, it was like I wasn't in control of my own body. My legs moved, but I didn't move them. I think if I had tried on my own, I would have fallen over many times. She sat me down at the kitchen table, which was a much darker colored wood than I remember. She said, "Write," and I began writing. I wrote for hours and I'm still writing. Now I'm watching her stare at me, gesturing with her hands. It's almost like she is slightly vibrating and flickering in and out of different positions as I look at her. If I look at her long enough, she seems to get older, her skin drier and more taut, and her hair degrading. But when I look away, she always goes back to how she was. The knocking is back now. Every wall seems to shake with its intensity. I don't know how much longer I can take it. The walls drip crimson with what I can only assume to be blood. The sky outside is jet black, and I can only see inches past the window, like the very world itself is closing in on me. I feel sick, like when you have a fever and the waves of dysphoria pour over you. The spiders are back, crawling everywhere. I can feel their hairy legs pricking my skin as they crawl over me. Every so often I close my eyes and go on small journeys, whether it's walking to the bus in the morning or brushing my teeth before bed. But the spiders and knocking are always there, and every corner turned, every peripheral of my eye. She is there, watching and waiting. The woman is looking at me right now and holding a rope, and is beckoning me to the staircase. I set the note down on the kitchen table and finally give in. I can't take this anymore. Help me, 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 help me. Did you find me? Did you find me? Did you find me? Did you find me? Please, brother. Asterisk. The following writing was discovered in a suicide note written by Amanita. Her parents are still in denial that she is dead. By her brother. And not. I'm the one who found her note. And I fear very soon I may end up the same. If the offer seems too good, listen to your gut, please. Hey all. I'm not sure why I'm sharing this story. It just shook me to my core, and I don't really have anyone to talk about it with. I'm 29 years old, male, and I just moved to the Northern California area about a month ago. I had a promising job lined up, being poor and without family or friends holding me to my hometown. It was an easy decision to follow the money. Being from a small town in South Dakota, the rent prices here blew me away. I don't know how you all do it. Anyhow, all the following events take place over 2 weeks. I spent the first couple days after arriving in the city of Sacramento sleeping in my car with my pet rat. His name is Chester. I spent most of my days wondering whether I was in the farm to fork capital or the city of trees and searching for housing. Most options for affordable rooms were hiding behind an anxiety-producing amount of paperwork, or it was some creep looking for someone who would warm up to the idea of being cuddling roommates. I shuddered at the idea of needing to accept that kind of help. On the third night, my luck seemed like it was turning around. A home. Well, a room in a home, but it had heating, which is more than I could say for my clunker of a Subaru, and the rent was only $400 a month flat. I knew there was going to be a catch. I just wish I had known what that trade-off would leave me with. I would have never gone to look at the room. The ad read as follows. Room for rent. 800 square feet room. $400/mo. No utility payments will go to you. And one shared bathroom. You'll have access to a full kitchen, parking in the rear alley, and lots of going-ons in the surrounding area. Bars, music venues, etc. No drugs, drinking, guests, or pets. Tilled. No pictures included. The required sobriety and no guests told me that whoever was renting the room was an oddball of some sort, but sleeping in my car another night with some weed shake was still worse. I emailed the poster hoping that Chester wouldn't be an issue. He's tiny and never leaves my side. After a nerve-wracking hour or so, I got an email back. Hey, thanks for your interest. I really don't like animals, but no one else has reached out. Why don't you come by this evening, and we can chat? ADDRESS REDACTD. Emailed from my iPhone body Grant. I took a couple minutes to do some celebratory fist pumps in my car and held Chester's hands and had him do a little happy dance. It was fun until I realized someone outside the car was staring at me with a concerned look of curiosity. I quickly stashed my little friend, waved at the stranger, and drove off towards my potential new home. Pulling up in my car, I was pleasantly surprised at how beautiful a house was. It was an old Victorian house with a fun paint job and a lovely front porch staring out at the busy street. I was already imagining spending mornings out there petting Chester and sipping coffee. I walked up and was going to knock on the door, but as I went to, Bobby opened it. Bobby stood much taller than me, and he looked down on me with very empty eyes. He was probably at least 6'4", with a barrel chest and cannons for arms. His stern face was covered in a thick beard that only made him look less welcoming. The one thing that threw me for a loop was his hair. Wavy locks of auburn hair fell just below his chest. I was kind of stunned, honestly. I don't think I've ever even seen a woman with hair so glamorous. I noticed I had been staring at him, and he looked like his patience was running thin. "Oh," I yelped, caught off guard. "Sorry, you scared me a little bit." "Weird, okay," Bobby flatly replied. This first impression was starting off just great. "Hey, this house is gorgeous. You're a lucky guy being able to live here." I tried to get off on a better foot and not screw up my only chance for a warm night indoors. "Luck, huh?" Bobby snorted. "My grandpa bought this home 30 years ago, when it was in shambles. I helped him restore it as a young man, and when he died, he left it to me. I earned this home." "Oh yeah." I just meant, I hated this. Being stuck in a one-on-one with someone who seemed to ignore all the unwritten rules of pleasant conversation. It didn't help how much he towered over me, too. I just wanted to seem submissive and agreeable. It's what he seemed to want, and I had no room to argue. I just meant that it's a really amazing home. You and your grandpa must have been as close as you both are talented. Just stop. Bobby cut me off. "You seem fine. I've been told I come off cold. It's just me. Relax, okay?" I internally sighed, grateful. He might still be an asshole, but at least I know it's not personal, I guess. I thanked him for saying as much, and he invited me in. We sat down in the living room. He poured us some tea, and we talked for an hour or so. I spared him hearing details about my personal life. I figured he wasn't the kind for small talk. He asked about where I had come from, what I was doing for work, and what my plans for the future were. Just basic screening of a stranger. I understood too as I sat in front of him wearing the same clothes I was wearing 2 days ago and holding a rat. He initially seemed kind of disgusted when he saw Chester, but as I spoke to him, I would give Chester pets and a cashew or two. I don't think Bobby loves my little guy like I do, but he seemed more curious than grossed out, and that seemed like the best case scenario. After I gave my life summary, Bobby shared a few details of his life with me. He grew up in the area with his grandparents. Apparently, his mother had left when he was born, and his father was either unable or didn't care enough to raise him alone. I decided it was best to not dig into that. Bobby's grandfather was a fairly successful businessman, apparently owning a large marble quarry in Italy, and moved with his young family to California. Whatever had happened with Bobby's dad, it had apparently pushed him out of the will, so Bobby got everything. Now he spent his days working out, reading books, and building unique carpentry projects. A simple man. I can respect that. Then I saw a little bit of life glow in his eyes, and he sheepishly said, "I've actually put a lot of effort into my hair lately." I was so caught off guard. It was like a switch had flipped. He was such a different man than who I spent the last hour talking to. It was even more extreme than that. It was like if you flipped the switch, and instead of a light coming on the entire room, swapped with another. I definitely wasn't going to miss an opportunity to gas him up, though. "Oh man, I can tell. It looks really good. What kind of stuff do you use?" He started giving me his routine, and I nodded happily, not knowing a thing he was talking about. A couple of hours passed, and Bobby was still in the shower. I put my ear up to the door and thought I heard something. It was quiet, but I could have sworn I heard Bobby singing. I didn't want to be too pushy, but I really needed to use the bathroom. I knocked on the door. "Hey, Bobby, are you going to be out soon? I really need to use the bathroom." Bobby replied flatly, "I'm not finished." I started to feel a bit desperate. The only thing worse than being a nuisance would be if I couldn't wait any longer. "Bobby, please, I need to." I started jiggling the doorknob. "I'm not FINISAHD," Bobby yelled. That scared me. I decided to head to a nearby coffee shop and use their bathroom instead. When I came back home, Bobby was still in the shower. Steam was now visibly pouring out from under the door. I started to wonder if he had been in there all day. I put my ear up to the door again, and this time, I clearly heard Bobby in a sing-song voice. Rinse and repeat. Rinse and repeat. Rinse and repeat. Maybe he had some sort of routine or obsession, but to spend over 12 hours in the shower seemed extreme. I ate dinner, went to my room, and eventually fell asleep, the constant sound of the water running in the background. This whole situation felt more and more unsettling, and I began to wonder if I had made the wrong decision in moving in here. I almost decided to leave, but with my job and limited budget, it seemed like a big decision. The next day, I went to work, but Bobby was still in the shower. This time, I could hear him singing louder. I tried not to think about it too much and focused on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. When I got home, I froze in front of the door. It couldn't be. Bobby was screaming now. Rinse and repeat. Rinse and repeat. Rinse and repeat. I stood there, heart racing, when our neighbor walked up. "Hey man, what's going on in there?" he asked. I felt my heart pounding. "I don't know. I'm really worried." The neighbor looked frustrated. I told him, if he keeps doing this, I'm calling the cops. Looking back, I wish I hadn't tried to calm him down. "Don't do that. Let me see what's going on," I said, even though I was still unsure of what to do. I opened the door and made my way toward the bathroom. Bobby's screaming echoed throughout the house, and there was a sense of unease, something telling me to turn and leave. But I kept going, pushing it down. I knocked on the bathroom door, calling out, "Bobby, hey, what's going on, man? You're scaring me." Bobby. I wasn't sure if he was ignoring me or couldn't hear me over his own loud singing. I knew I had to do something. Bobby wasn't in a good mental state, that much was clear. I backed up a couple of steps and then pushed forward, shoulder first, into the bathroom door. As soon as I entered, I was hit with a wall of steam. There was a strange smell in the air, almost metallic, and it mixed with the steam, becoming thicker. Rinse and repeat, rinse, and repeat, rinse, and repeat. Bobby screamed, louder and more urgently. I walked around the corner of the small wall that separated the toilet from the shower. What I saw made my stomach turn. The glass shower wall was covered in blood. Rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. Bebo BB. Come Owen, what's going Owen? I reached toward the door handle, my hand shaking, my mind screaming at me to stop. But it was like I was no longer in control. When I opened the door, a mixture of water and blood flooded onto the floor. I couldn't believe my eyes. Bobby was smiling. A twisted smile. Something like if an alien wearing human skin was trying to smile but didn't get the subtleties and ended up looking a creep. Above Bobby's sick grin, he was scrubbing conditioner into his hair. Except, it wasn't his hair anymore. He had scratched so hard, he had torn the skin on the top of his hair. Flaps of skin draped off the sides of his skull. Flesh and hair had clogged the drain. His fingernails were mostly gone, removed from continuous and furious scratching at his exposed skull. I vomited, adding to the noxious mixture of blood. Chunks of flesh and water that was pooled on the floor. Bobby looked at me. Blood was flowing down his face and into his eyes that were so wide open, I could have believed he had cut his eyelids off. I screamed a primal scream. Something animalistic, a reptilian brain reaction to the horror I was witnessing. Our neighbor appeared in the bathroom, having heard all the commotion. Jesus Christ, what he ill. Bobby inhaled deeply and let out one more strong rinse and repeat, then collapsed in the mess on the floor. We called 911, but Bobby was dead by the time they got there. Loss of blood, they said. I didn't know what had happened. I told everything I did know to the first responders, and then they loaded up Bobby and left. I got Chester some necessary items and left. I could come back for the rest, but I couldn't be there anymore. Because Bobby was dead, there wasn't much of a way to figure out what had happened. It seemed like he had just snapped, and my being there was only bad timing and even worse luck. Like I said, I'm not sure exactly why I wanted to share this, but I needed to tell someone. I couldn't carry it in my head anymore. So if you got to the end here, thanks for sharing in my trauma, and sorry too, I guess. Also, if anyone in the Sacramento area has a place for me to live, I'd appreciate it. I'm finishing this story at a local gym. I got a membership to be able to use the showers. There was a little bit of the ad infinitum left over. It didn't seem right to let such expensive stuff go to waste, and Bobby wasn't going to be using it anymore. Let's see how pretty my hair can be. There's a place on the dark web where you can buy and sell guilt. It came in a vial by mail. There was an injection kit, but no instructions. The instructions were on the dark website, the guilt marketplace. The first time Alex had done it, he'd used a belt, located a vein on his forearm, and injected the entire liquid at once. That was what the instructions said you had to do to get paid. It was only theft, but the hit had been hard, like being hugged by someone made of razor blades. The pain lingered for weeks. But the BTC showed up in his wallet as promised. It helped Alex survive. He started doing it regularly after that. He quit his job and did guilt. The website concept was simple. If you felt guilty about something, anything, you could auction off that guilt, or a fraction of it, to one or more bidders who'd suffer it for you. The transactions were anonymous. The reasons for the guilt had to be described, but it didn't matter what they were. If someone was willing to take it, the marketplace facilitated the transaction. Alex had started light, but eventually moved on to the harder, more lucrative stuff. When he took his first murder guilt, 1/25th, he thought he'd die, but he didn't. And the BTC. When I opened the door, a mixture of water and blood flooded onto the floor. I couldn't believe my eyes. Bobby was smiling. A twisted smile. Something like if an alien wearing human skin was trying to smile but didn't get the subtleties and ended up looking a creep. Above Bobby's sick grin, he was scrubbing conditioner into his hair. Except, It wasn't his hair anymore. He had scratched so hard, he had torn the skin on the top of his hair. Flaps of skin draped off the sides of his skull. Flesh and hair had clogged the drain. His fingernails were mostly gone, removed from continuous and furious scratching at his exposed skull. I vomited, adding to the noxious mixture of blood, chunks of flesh and water that was pooled on the floor. Bobby looked at me. Blood was flowing down his face and into his eyes that were so wide open, I could have believed he had cut his eyelids off. I screamed a primal scream. Something animalistic, a reptilian brain reaction to the horror I was witnessing. Our neighbor appeared in the bathroom, having heard all the commotion. Jesus Christ, what D-E-E-H-L. Bobby inhaled deeply and let out one more strong rinse and R-E-P-E-A-T, then collapsed in the mess on the floor. We called 911, but Bobby was dead by the time they got there. Loss of blood, they said. I didn't know what had happened. I told everything I did know to the first responders, and then they loaded up Bobby and left. I got Chester, some necessary items, and left. I could come back for the rest, but I couldn't be there anymore. Because Bobby was dead, there wasn't much of a way to figure out what had happened. It seemed like he had just snapped, and my being there was only bad timing and even worse luck. Like I said, I'm not sure exactly why I wanted to share this, but I needed to tell someone. I couldn't carry it in my head anymore. So if you got to the end here, thanks for sharing in my trauma, and sorry too, I guess. Also, if anyone in the Sacramento area has a place for me to live, I'd appreciate it. I'm finishing this story at a local gym. I got a membership to be able to use the showers. There was a little bit of the ad infinitum left over. It didn't seem right to let such expensive stuff go to waste, and Bobby wasn't going to be using it anymore. Let's see how pretty my hair can be. There's a place on the dark web where you can buy and sell guilt. It came in a vial by mail. There was an injection kit, but no instructions. The instructions were on the dark website, the guilt marketplace. The first time Alex had done it, he'd used a belt, located a vein on his forearm, and injected the entire liquid at once. That was what the instructions said you had to do to get paid. It was only theft, but the hit had been hard, like being hugged by someone made of razor blades. The pain lingered for weeks. But the BTC showed up in his wallet as promised. It helped Alex survive. He started doing it regularly after that. He quit his job and did guilt. The website concept was simple. If you felt guilty about something, anything, you could auction off that guilt, or a fraction of it, to one or more bidders who'd suffer it for you. The transactions were anonymous. The reasons for the guilt had to be described, but it didn't matter what they were. If someone was willing to take it, the marketplace facilitated the transaction. Alex had started light, but eventually moved on to the harder, more lucrative stuff. When he took his first murder guilt, 1/25th, he thought he'd die, but he didn't. And the BTC arrived. Then Alex met Angie. She was a fellow student, and he introduced her to the marketplace, starting her off gently but getting her systematically into harder and harder hits. Angie was good at suffering, better even than he was, and she did it all, tiny fractions of even the most heinous acts. The combined income was good. One day, Angie saw a marketplace listing for something absolutely putrid, despicable, abuse and cruelty that was almost unimaginable. Total pot, $25 million. We should take it all. Each do half, she suggested. I couldn't live with myself, said Alex. He meant it. They'd spent the last few weeks racking their brains to come up with a way of gaming the system, but it seemed impossible. The market was truly free, self-regulating. If you took on guilt for $X, you could resell that guilt for only $X because it was the same guilt, and that was its market value. No gain. Angie completed the $25 million transaction anyway. When the vial arrived, she switched labels and watched Alex inject with what he believed was mere assault. The hit destroyed him. Angie watched him writhe on the floor, His muscles tightened to the point of snapping, foaming at the mouth, unable to speak as he experienced a guilt he was in no way prepared for, that nobody could be prepared for. Then she brought him a knife. It couldn't be murder, she decided. It had to be suicide. So she put the knife in his hand and encouraged him to kill himself. Finally, he slit his own throat. Then, feeling her guilt begin to rise, she put it up for auction on the marketplace. There were takers. Total pot. $10 million. Only a few days, she told herself, and she suffered horribly. But then the pain was lifted, and she was free. She had gamed the system. She had become the first person to successfully launder guilt. I wish I never stumbled upon the show called Eat It or Else. We were just two fat kids who stuck out like chewed bubblegum on the bottom of a shoe. It was our last summer before freshman year of high school, when things would get a little more serious for us in Woodward Harbor. My best friend Paul wore his obesity like a suit of armor. Not even the harshest of insults could break through. I, on the other hand, could barely stay on my feet from the verbal pummeling I took daily. Luckily, I had Paul by my side to fight my battles. Our little town of 6,000 provided little amenities for teens. Sure, we could throw rocks from the dock and chase seagulls around until we were out of breath, but growing up in our little seaside dump made life turn into a series of chores without an allowance. So I was quite fortunate to spend my free time hanging out with Paul, especially when we were bored beyond belief. Paul also helped me take my mind off the accident. My father, Clark, had perished from a forklift accident. I was only a kid at the time, but my mother, Catherine, told me in as simple terms as she could manage that Dad slipped out of the lift while he was going up a loading dock, and it fell over onto him, crushing him. I never saw his body, and I've been told it was for the best. Mother worked the overnight waitress shift at our downtown diner, Simmer Down by the Sea, so I was home alone most nights. Paul's parents just happened to work the same schedule as Mother's, as police officer and nurse, respectively, which meant most nights Paul and I could kick it. It was a Friday afternoon when our world changed. We dropped by the convenience store for sodas and snacks like we usually did before an evening of video games and TV. Paul spotted an 8th grade classmate of ours, Tina Hutton, just before she was leaving the parking lot. "Hey Tina," Paul said, trying to contain a smile. "Paul," Tina responded stone-faced, uninterested. "Do you like butter?" What kind of lame question is that? Well, if you do, you can be the butter to these rolls. Paul lifted his shirt and jiggled his blubber. "You're disgusting, Paul," she responded, and stormed off. Paul high-fived me as I followed him into the store. "She's into me," he said, grabbing a bag of chips. "I don't know, dude." She didn't look too impressed. Of course, she's not going to show it, but I know how she feels. She wants Paulie. She'll come around one of these days. After gathering the supplies, I took out the 20 Mother had given me and paid the cashier, Ronnie, a slender, always irritated old man who looked back at us with disgust. "Have you ever considered a banana?" he said to us, pointing to a bowl of rotting bananas sitting atop the counter. "Maybe next time," Paul replied, grabbing the bag of snacks. "Why are people so mean to us?" I asked Paul during the walk back to my house. "That old man is a dickweed. Just ignore him. He's probably miserable just sitting on that stool all day and night." I nodded and felt a little better. We exchanged laughs during the 15-minute walk home. After going inside and greeting Mother, we retreated to my room and played some multiplayer fighting games for the next 4 hours. "All right, dude, I'm bored. Think you kicked my ass enough times. Do you want to watch some TV?" I asked. "Hell yeah. Maybe we can find that show with that woman remodeling her house. You remember the size of those things on her? They were enormous." A day never passed where Paul didn't have women on the mind. While I admired his confidence, I felt hideous. I didn't think anyone would ever date me or even consider dating me. My confidence was at an all-time low. Stress eating was practically one of my hobbies. I started flipping the channels. "Stop," Check this out, Paul shouted. Good evening, all you food lovers, and welcome back to Eat It or Else. The woman on the TV looked morbidly obese. Her sad tiny eyes, nose, and mouth were surrounded by a mass of fat. The shape of her body with the white pants and pink tank top made her resemble a giant ice cream cone. Our eyes were glued to the TV. The voice off camera continued. A show where living large can put you in charge. No more getting made fun of. No more put-downs. Everyone loves you here. You can get the respect you deserve. But the task at hand will not be easy. You will have to survive 6 rounds against our defending champion, Chrissy Crumb. The camera panned to a studio audience of adults cheering and clapping. The shot changed. Back to the stage. A tall, slender woman walked out from behind the curtains. The camera zoomed in on her. She wore a gray business suit and silver bangs dangled like icicles over her forehead. And I'm your host, Waggy Maggie. Thank you for allowing me to be here tonight, right here in Woodward Harbor. That's right. We are casting for our live show right downtown. Do you have what it takes to be the next contestant on? Waggy Maggie pointed the microphone at the crowd, and they yelled, "Eat it or else." Come on down to our studio on 32 Brighton Drive. You must be between the ages of 12 and 18 to participate. A parental chaperone is not required. Knock 3 times on the door, and when the security guard opens the door, just ask for Waggy Maggie. Paul grabbed my shoulders. Holy shit, dude. This is like the coolest thing that has ever happened in town. I have to be on this show. Let's go. Why? Did you see that Chrissy woman? She looked like she didn't even want to be there. Put your shoes on. I'm biking over there right now. You should come and watch me win. I'll eat anything, man. You know that. I glanced back at the TV. The show returned from a commercial break. The camera remained on Chrissy Crumb, who awkwardly paced back and forth while a catchy tune played. There was something off about the show. My stomach churned watching this woman in the spotlight. I looked back at Paul, but he was gone, already out the front door. I reluctantly joined him. When we arrived at the industrial business area street, we located the building and went up to the front door. What struck me as odd was the empty parking lot. Only a handful of cars in the giant lot. The dull and cold-looking building made me a little uneasy, but Paul was overly excited. He knocked 3 times. A buff security guard opened the door. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to play on your show, to meet Waggy Maggie," Paul replied, giggling. "Come on in," he responded. I tried to follow Paul inside, but the guard stopped me. "Hey, you're not allowed in. Only one new contestant at a time. You will have to just watch him on the TV." The man gently pushed me back outside, and I had no choice but to do as he said. Paul looked at me and smiled. "It's okay, dude. I'll come by after the show. After tonight, everyone will know who I am. Everyone's going to remember Polly. Hey, maybe you should tell Tina to tune in." "Are you sure about this?" I whispered. "This place looks kind of creepy." "I'm fine. I'll see you soon." The guard closed the door, and I just stood there quietly for a few minutes, eventually placing my ear against the door, hoping to hear something, anything to reassure me everything was okay. The silence lingered to the point it was unbearable. I started talking aloud to myself. "He's okay. They are probably just getting all the cameras ready. They probably just need to get everything set up. This is stupid. I'm going home." I got back on my bike and started making my way back home. Before I could exit the parking lot, a couple of bullies swarmed me. Zach Preston and Lane Hudson, 2 airheads going nowhere in life, who loved spending their free time bothering me. Zach, the taller of the morons, shoved me off my bike. "Ethan, what are you doing out here all alone? Don't you know your mom worries when you ride after dark? She's probably waiting to tuck your fat ass into bed." I looked at Zach's shoes, avoided eye contact because I knew it would make things worse. Lane, with his military-style buzz cut, squatted down to my level and pinched my right arm. "Did you get fatter since I last saw you?" Lane stood up and turned to Zach. I think he got fatter. Good thing his dad is dead. The man probably wouldn't be able to stand the sight of his own son. My hands burned from the fall onto the gravel. I pressed my palms further against those tiny little rocks and imagined I had a giant rock in my hand that I could bash against their skulls. I felt another pinch from Lane. Do you have anything to say, or are you just going to sit there like the wimp of Woodward Harbor that you are? I remained silent and showed no emotion. If I even attempted to fight back, they'd probably stab me with their keys. Let's get out of here, Zach said, hopping onto his bike. Lane joined him, and they rode off into the dark, as the first of many tears flooded my cheeks. My first stop upon returning home was going straight to the kitchen. I popped open the pantry and reached for the bag of chocolates Mother had stashed behind the cereal boxes. I must have consumed 15 chocolate balls in a matter of seconds. I didn't even wash my dirty, bleeding hands before I went right for the junk food. I think I may have even swallowed a few little rocks that were wedged into my hand. I ran to my room and turned on the TV. Waggy Maggie was on camera, standing next to Chrissy Crumb. And we are back live from the studio in Woodward Harbor. We are excited to meet our challenger for the evening. Backstage, he told us his nickname is Paulie, and that he looked forward to winning the crown tonight. And that's the kind of confidence we love to see around here. So let's not leave him waiting any longer. Please welcome to the stage, Paul Paulie Sullivan. The crowd roared with applause and cheer as my best friend strutted to the stage like he'd been doing this entire life, a natural showman. Paul, it's great having you here tonight. You look eager to prove yourself, and more importantly, you look hungry. Are you hungry to win, or just hungry to eat? Waggy Maggie smirked and pointed the microphone back at the audience. They chuckled. A man in a white chef outfit wheeled out a table with 2 trays on it. For our first round, a sweet treat to excite the taste buds. Double chocolate fudge brownies. The rules are simple. You must eat the entire portion placed here before you in order to advance to the second round. You have to eat it or else. Waggy Maggie signaled for the chef to remove the covers from the trays. Paul's eyes bulged. This is too easy. I've had an entire box of brownies before. He nudged Chrissy Crumb, and she retreated away from his touch. Such confidence. We love to see it. That's what it's going to take to have a shot at winning tonight, Paul. Waggy Maggie looked at the camera and nodded. Are you ready to eat it, or else? It's time to begin. A buzzer sounded as Chrissy Crumb and Paul stepped up to their respective trays. Chrissy took a massive glob of brownies and stuffed it into her mouth. She quickly reached for another handful, and then another. In a matter of 30 seconds, her tray was empty. Meanwhile, Paul struggled to finish his in a timely manner. My own palms started to sweat seeing him struggle. Waggy Maggie approached Paul. How are you doing, Paul? Are you ready to throw in the towel? Never made it out of his brownie-filled mouth. He scooped up the last chunk of brownie and shoved it in his mouth. I looked at Zach's shoes, avoided eye contact because I knew it would make things worse. Lane, with his military-style buzz cut, squatted down to my level and pinched my right arm. Did you get fatter since I last saw you? Lane stood up and turned to Zach. I think he got fatter. Good thing his dad is dead. The man probably wouldn't be able to stand the sight of his own son. My hands burned from the fall onto the gravel. I pressed my palms further against those tiny little rocks and imagined I had a giant rock in my hand that I could bash against their skulls. I felt another pinch from Lane. Do you have anything to say, or are you just going to sit there like the wimp of Woodward Harbor that you are? I remained silent and showed no emotion. If I even attempted to fight back, they'd probably stab me with their keys. Let's get out of here, Zach said, hopping onto his bike. Lane joined him, and they rode off into the dark, as the first of many tears flooded my cheeks. My first stop upon returning home was going straight to the kitchen. I popped open the pantry and reached for the bag of chocolates Mother had stashed behind the cereal boxes. I must have consumed 15 chocolate balls in a matter of seconds. I didn't even wash my dirty, bleeding hands before I went right for the junk food. I think I may have even swallowed a few little rocks that were wedged into my hand. I ran to my room and turned on the TV. Waggy Maggie was on camera, standing next to Chrissy Crumb. And we are back live from the studio in Woodward Harbor. We are excited to meet our challenger for the evening. Backstage, he told us his nickname is Polly, and that he looked forward to winning the crown tonight. And that's the kind of confidence we love to see around here. So, let's not leave him waiting any longer. Please welcome to the stage, Paul Polly Sullivan. The crowd roared with applause and cheer as my best friend strutted to the stage like he'd been doing this entire life, a natural showman. Paul, it's great having you here tonight. You look eager to prove yourself, and more importantly, you look hungry. Are you hungry to win or just hungry to eat? Waggy Maggie smirked and pointed the microphone back at the audience. They chuckled. A man in a white chef outfit wheeled out a table with 2 trays on it. For our first round, a sweet treat to excite the taste buds. Double chocolate fudge brownies. The rules are simple. You must eat the entire portion placed here before you in order to advance to the second round. You have to eat it or else. Waggy Maggie signaled for the chef to remove the covers from the trays. Paul's eyes bulged. This is too easy. I've had an entire box of brownies before. He nudged Chrissy Crumb, and she retreated away from his touch. Such confidence. We love to see it. That's what it's going to take to have a shot at winning tonight, Paul. Waggy Maggie looked at the camera and nodded. Are you ready to eat it or else? It's time to begin. A buzzer sounded as Chrissy Crumb and Paul stepped up to their respective trays. Chrissy took a massive glob of brownies and stuffed it into her mouth. She quickly reached for another handful, and then another. In a matter of 30 seconds, her tray was empty. Meanwhile, Paul struggled to finish his in a timely manner. My own palms started to sweat seeing him struggle. Waggy Maggie approached Paul. How are you doing, Paul? Are you ready to throw in the towel? Never made it out of his brownie-filled mouth. He scooped up the last chunk of brownie and shoved it in his mouth. Shimon, dude, finish it. Don't spit it out. You can do it, I mumbled. The camera zoomed in on Paul's face. I sighed in relief when I saw him swallow the last pieces of brownie. Waggy Maggie handed Chrissy and Paul bottles of water. Paul chugged his. That was impressive, Paul. But unfortunately, there is no break before our next round. Roberto, will you please bring out the next dish? The chef wheeled out another cart. Yuck, what the hell is that? Is that chewed up gum? Paul yelled. Good guess, Paul. That's right. Earlier this evening, we asked several audience members to chew gum and return it to us for this dish. However, we felt like being a little generous as this is only the second round. So we are offering you a cheese-based dip for your gumballs. The camera zoomed in on the plate of chewed bubble gumballs. My own stomach squirmed in disgust. You may begin, Waggy Maggie said. Paul hesitated but then reached for a gumball when he saw Chrissy downing them quickly. He put one in the dip and then swallowed it in one bite. He must have consumed a dozen or so pieces by the time the plate was empty. A nervous energy took hold of me as I waited for the reveal of the third round dish. Vomit tickled the back of my throat when the camera focused in on the next offering. Teeth. A giant pile of human teeth. Paul glanced at Waggy Maggie and Chrissy in the audience, hoping it was all a joke, just a prank before the real dish was served. There's no way. I'm not eating a bunch of teeth. That's not even food, he said. Are you saying you are done, that you are dropping out of the contest? Waggy Maggie asked. Chrissy, are you going to eat this? He asked. Chrissy lifted the plate to her mouth, and the teeth rolled and bounced like rocks tumbling down a steep mountain. She chewed and chewed, each crunch like a knife twisting in my ear. Paul looked queasy, face turning green. I looked away for a few seconds to gather myself. When my vision returned to the screen, Chrissy finished swallowing the teeth while Paul gagged and coughed and closed his eyes. I can't do it. No way. I'm done. I'm out, he said. The room went silent. Waggy Maggie approached Paul and slowly lifted the microphone to her face. He's out. Our newest contestant, Paul Polly Sullivan of Woodward Harbor, has given up. While it was a commendable effort, Chrissy has proven once again that nobody can take her down. Paul, we thank you for your participation this evening, but I'm afraid it's time to let you go. Waggy Maggie looked down at the floor where Paul stood and then stepped away from him. She motioned for someone off camera with a stern nod. My jaw dropped when the floor below Paul opened, sending Paul vanishing like a magic trick. His screams reminded me of the time our neighbor, Mitch, accidentally dropped his newborn into the sea while playing with him on the dock. That dreadful, helpless feeling when you have experienced the unimaginable. That can't be real. I'm sure he is okay. He's probably chilling in a room somewhere backstage. I mumbled to myself, trying to cope with the visual that challenged my teenage brain. The camera lingered on Chrissy Crumb while she swayed back and forth with the slightest hint of a smile. Waggy Maggie handed Chrissy a trophy, and she raised it above her head. No sign of Paul. The show ended, and I sat there quietly, waiting for my friend to return. An hour passed, and he still was gone. I couldn't handle it anymore, so I hopped back on my bike and rode back to the studio. I knocked on the door, and the same buffed security guard opened it. I'm looking for my friend Paul. He was just on your TV show. Quickly rolled off my tongue before he could speak. There's no Paul here. I'm afraid you are mistaken. The man started to push the door closed. I lodged my arm in the opening before he could close it all the way. Wait, what are you talking about? My friend came over earlier and he was just on your show. He fell through the floor. Is he backstage hanging out? Look, kid, I don't know what you are talking about. My body shook with frustration, heart pounding against my skin-tight sweater. I said the only thing that I thought would get me in the building. I'm here to see Waggy Maggie. I want to play on your show. Come on in, the man said, and yanked me inside. He led me down a musty, dimly lit hall where he eventually nudged me into a room for contestants to get briefed before they took the stage. I sat on a couch by myself, waiting for someone to give me instructions. The sound of squeaking shoes approached. Each step reminded me of those noisy chew toys a dog puts in their mouth. And then I saw her, Waggy Maggie. She towered over me. Her silver bangs looked like they were sharp enough to stab someone with. Name, she said, annoyed. I was too distracted by her intimidating presence. What is your name? Do not waste my time. We have several episodes to shoot tonight. Sorry about that. I'm Ethan. My friend Paul was here earlier tonight. Yes, of course. Paul Polly Sullivan of Woodward Harbor. A real charmer, that one. Unfortunate that he did not make it all the way to the end. Do you know where he is? I quickly asked. He never came back home after the show. Ethan, I'm guessing you saw him disappear and are worried sick, as they say. Am I correct in saying that? Yes, where does that hole go to? Is he still here in the studio? Ethan, we cannot give away our secrets. If I told you where that hole went, you'd tell your friends, and they would tell their friends, and our show would not live to see another day. I just want to see my friend. Where is he? I noticed a few red spots on the right side of her gray suit. She could tell that I was scared. Look, I'm not leaving until I see Paul, I said, digging the palms of my hands into the couch cushions. Ethan, you are such a loyal friend. I'm going to give you an opportunity to see your friend. You will compete on our show. Win or lose, you will see Paul again after the taping. I nodded. Okay. I was not someone who enjoyed being in the spotlight. Attention drawn to me typically result in me feeling like a complete loser. Years of bullying for your weight takes a toll on you. As I stood on stage in the dark, waiting for the lights and cameras to turn, sweat soaked up my clothes. I suddenly had an urge to run off stage and get out of there, but then the lights flipped on, and the room was buzzing with energy from the crowd. I was stuck. A few feet to my right stood Chrissy Crumb in her ice cream attire. She ignored me. I gazed out at the crowd, and noticed something eerie about the audience members. They almost all looked similar in appearance, with only slight variations between the men and women. Overly large cartoonish eyebrows on the men with chiseled jaws like Mom used to go on about while watching her romance shows on TV. All the women had long blonde hair, and their faces were caked with makeup to the point they looked like plastic dolls. Waggy Maggie walked out to join us on stage. "Good evening, Woodward Harbor, and welcome to Eat It or Else." The crowd stood up in unison and emitted a sound of roars that sounded fake, like an audio recording of cheers. The audience members' mouths were open wide, but it was hard to tell whether they were making noise or not. "Tonight, we welcome to the show Ethan. Good luck to you, Ethan. Our defending champion, Chrissy Crumb, is hungry and ready to retain her spot at the top. Roberto, bring out the first dish." The chef wheeled out a table and removed the lids from the plates. 2 tall cups with a white liquid inside. "Mayonnaise shakes," Waggy Maggie shouted. The chef handed Chrissy and I straws. "Ethan, this should be an easy one for you. Your people are obsessed with condiments," Waggy Maggie said, making my stomach rumble in disgust. "Your world is number 1 at consumption." I had no intention of drinking that disgusting shake. I just wanted to see Paul. "I'm not doing it. I'm out," I said. Waggy Maggie looked stunned, in utter shock at how fast I had given up. "You haven't even tasted it yet," she said. "No chance. Send me into the hole," I replied. Waggy Maggie glanced at the audience and then back at me. "Into the hole. Someone has seen an episode or 2 before." The crowd chuckled as I braced myself for being dropped into darkness. I was not prepared for my stomach to shoot up to my mouth. I tumbled down a slide for what felt like an hour when in reality it was only seconds. After landing in a spongy, foam-like pit, I crawled over to the concrete floor. The walls were pulsating with almost blinding white and blue lights, on and off. Brightness to darkness, back and forth. I stood up and made my way down the corridor. Childlike screams penetrated my ears. I ran towards the noise. To my right, a room with a giant see-through window came into view. A kid around my age was in a human-sized claw toy machine, surrounded by bloody limbs all around him. Outside of the machine, a woman was moving the joystick of the machine as what appeared to be a razor-sharp claw loomed over the kid's head. The woman pressed the button, and the claw lowered, clamping onto the kid's head, squishing it in the process. His eyeballs popped from their sockets, and I ducked down out of view, horrified from the image. I crawled past the window and continued down the hallway, shuddering in fear, on the verge of fainting. But then I heard a familiar voice, "All. Please no, don't do this," he said from a short distance. I came upon another visible room. I raised my head just enough to see what was happening. Paul was strapped down on a table, trying to break free. A group of women were huddled around him, amused at his attempt to free himself from the metallic chains. The 5 women locked arms in a circle around the table. Their skin stretched and connected to each other, forming one giant blob of skin. Paul was no longer visible, like a drill going into drywall. The now one giant circular body closed in on Paul, chunks of table pieces shredded and flying in the air. Paul's screams of agony will haunt me for the rest of my days. Pieces of his body churned like a milkshake being whisked. Blood and guts flew in the air. An imprint of his face pressed through the back of the woman's skin. I ran, sobbing uncontrollably. Another room with big glass windows appeared to my right. Inside of the room sat Chrissy Crumb. She lifted her head to meet my eyes, and her expression gave me no hope. She looked dead inside. "What is this place?" I murmured. The sounds of an elevator opening rerouted my attention to the end of the hall. Waggy Maggie stepped out and approached me. She took her right hand and slowly peeled off her face, exposing a concoction of hundreds of little wire-like cables that rose up and down across her face, like those squiggly lines on a hospital vital sign monitor. "Ethan, your planet has been such a fascinating one to explore. We have learned so much from you humans. Obesity, as you call it, is such an interesting concept. Our kind does not gain weight when consuming. For you humans to be obsessed with eating to the point your body grows and breaks down, well, it has given us a new understanding of the human species. Why did you kill my friend? Why are you doing this to us? I yelled. It should not be a concern of yours. Humans will simply reproduce. It is what they do. There will be another Ethan and Paul out there very soon. I'm sure of it. Waggy Maggie grabbed my left arm and started to drag me to the elevator. No, let me go. I will admit, your fleshy appearances are rather likable. This skin suit I've been wearing does please me when I look at your mirrors. Before Waggy Maggie got me into the elevator, I heard glass shatter. I looked behind me. Chrissy Crumb had broken out of her room. She came charging at us and tackled Waggy Maggie to the ground. I watched her bite right into Waggy Maggie's face, pulling out chunks of wire. She continued to chew off pieces of her face until there was nothing left. Follow me. We need to get out of here, she said to me. We took the elevator up and stepped out onto the ground level where I had first entered the building. We heard commotion from the room where the show was filmed. In the studio, Paul's father and several other officers were firing guns at rabid audience members. Dozens of these alien-like beings no longer looked human. The human skin coverings were melting and sliding off their bodies. Paul's father looked back at me. Get outside. We've got this. I didn't have it in me to tell him his son was dead. Chris Crumb guided me to the front of the building and back outside to the parking lot. We watched as the building rumbled violently. Ethan. I heard Mom scream from behind me. She ran up to me and hugged me. Are you okay? I nodded. Next to Mom was Tina. I was watching the show and saw you on there. I went to the restaurant to tell your mom to check it out, so she turned it on at the diner. But after you disappeared below the floor and never showed up again, she got worried. So we headed over here. Paul's father emerged from the door with the other officers. Back up, back way up. This place is going to crumble, he shouted. We ran back to the street behind the parking lot. Together, we watched as the building slowly broke apart and fell into the water. Ethan, do you know where Paul is? Paul's father asked me. He never leaves your side. I'm sorry. He didn't make it. Those things got him, came out of my mouth. Paul's father wiped a tear from his cheek. He bent down to my level and hugged me. I learned that Chrissy Crumb had competed on the first episode of the show in another city, and that the aliens promised to keep her alive as long as she continued to win. Woodward Harbor was never the same after that night. 5 kids, including Paul, had perished. We never fully understood how Waggy Maggie and the others functioned. Once Chrissy Crumb had killed Waggy Maggie, it's like the others malfunctioned and went into a frenzy. For years, my eating habits continued to spiral for the worse. With Paul gone, my urge to turn to food for comfort grew to an alarming level. It was not until I was old enough to move out of that town and distance myself from the town and the events that took place was I then able to get things under control with my weight. I hate to say it though, but Waggy Maggie was right. We humans are obsessed with eating. And I don't know whether that is a good or bad thing. It doesn't really matter. I just wish Paul was still around. The void between. When the tether snapped, Martinez didn't scream. The sound died in her throat as she watched the Helios station drift away, its silver hull growing smaller against the star-speckled darkness until it was just another point of light in the infinite black. In that first moment of separation, time seemed to stretch like taffy, her mind recording every excruciating detail with crystalline clarity. She remembered the sound, a sharp ping that resonated through her suit's structure, followed by an uncanny silence. The carbon fiber tether, rated for tensions far beyond what she was exerting, had separated as cleanly as if it had been cut. Later, in her more lucid moments, she would wonder if something out there had cut it deliberately. 6 hours earlier, she'd been drinking coffee in the station's observation module, watching the sunrise over the Pacific for the 3rd time that day. Station Commander Chen had approached her about a routine maintenance check on the external sensor array. A simple job she'd performed dozens of times before. Should take you 2 hours tops, Martinez, he'd said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. Be back in time for Sarah's birthday celebration. Sarah. Martinez's hand instinctively went to the small photo tucked into her suit's wrist computer. Her daughter's 4th birthday, captured just weeks before this mission began. The movement sent her into a slow spin, and she fought down a wave of nausea as the earth and stars traded places in her field of view. The maintenance itself had been going perfectly. She'd replaced 2 degraded optical sensors and was in the process of recalibrating the thermal imaging array when she noticed something odd. A shadow had passed over her work area. Impossible, given their orbital position and angle relative to the Earth. She'd looked up, expecting to see one of the station's solar panels, but there had been nothing. Nothing except a momentary distortion in the starfield, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. That's when the tether broke. Her suit's stabilizers kicked in automatically, firing brief bursts of gas to arrest her spin. Each tiny jet of vapor was precious. The maneuvering fuel was limited, and she'd need every molecule if rescue came. If. The word hung in her mind like a death sentence. Helios Station. This is Martinez. She called into her radio, forcing her voice to remain steady. Emergency, emergency. Tether failure during EVA. I am untethered and drifting. Static answered her. She checked her suit's communications panel. Everything showed green, but the signal strength meter was already dropping. Helios Station, please respond. She could still see the station clearly, its solar arrays catching the sunlight like golden wings. Someone had to be monitoring her frequency. They had to see her drifting away. This is Martinez. Does anyone copy? The static took on a different quality, a rhythmic pulsing that made her think of heartbeats. For a moment, she thought she heard voices buried in the noise. Not the familiar tones of her crewmates, but something else. Something that spoke in frequencies that made her teeth ache. She forced herself to look away from the radio and assess her situation. The suit's diagnostic panel displayed her vital statistics with cruel precision. Heart rate elevated but within acceptable parameters. Oxygen supply at 97%. Power systems nominal. 8 hours of life. Assuming nothing else failed. 8 hours during which she would drift further and further from the station. From Earth, from everything human. The math was simple and terrible. At her current velocity, she checked the laser rangefinder. She was moving away from the station at just over 2 meters per second. Too slow for a quick death in the atmosphere. Too fast for her remaining maneuvering fuel to make a difference. The backup beacon would transmit her location for 72 hours, but she'd be long dead before then if rescue didn't come quickly. She tried to remember her emergency training. Step 1. Assess immediate threats to life. None, beyond the obvious fact that she was floating in an environment lethal to human life. Step 2. Establish communication. Failed. Step 3. Conserve resources and wait for rescue. That was all that remained, waiting, floating in a perfect void with only her thoughts for company. The earth hung below her, a blue and white goddess that filled nearly a quarter of her field of view. Martinez had always loved looking at it from space, had spent countless hours in the cupola module just watching the continents drift past. But now something was different. The longer she stared, the more the clouds seemed to move with purpose, forming patterns that tickled the edge of recognition. She blinked hard and looked away, focusing instead on the station. It was noticeably smaller now, its detailed structure reduced to a bright cruciform shape against the black. She thought she could see movement. The emergency airlock opening perhaps, a rescue attempt being mounted. But distance and imagination could play tricks on the eyes, especially in space, where there was no atmosphere to provide scale or context. A red light began flashing on her heads-up display. The radio was detecting a signal, but when she activated the receiver, what came through wasn't Chen's reassuring voice or Mission Control's professional calm. It was a sound that had no business existing in the vacuum of space, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to bypass her ears entirely and vibrate directly in her skull. Martinez quickly shut off the radio. The sound stopped, but she could feel an echo of it lingering in her bones, like the memory of a bass note played too loud. She looked back at the earth, and for a moment, just a moment, she could have sworn she saw something massive moving beneath the clouds, something that made white thunderheads look like foam on the surface of a much deeper sea. The first hours. The earth hung below her like a marble wrapped in wispy cotton, impossibly distant. She'd seen it 1,000 times through the station's windows, but now it felt different. Wrong. The longer she stared, the more it seemed to pulse and shift, as if something vast was stirring beneath those clouds. The terminator line between day and night appeared to writhe, like the edge of an enormous eyelid slowly closing. Martinez had always prided herself on her psychological resilience. The NASA screening process was rigorous. Countless hours of isolation tanks, stress tests, psychological evaluations. She'd scored in the 99th percentile for stress tolerance. Like a submarine made of diamond, her evaluator had written. Now that submarine was developing hairline cracks, and the pressure outside was infinite, she began her survival checklist. The procedures drilled into her through countless simulations. The rhythmic nature of the checks was supposed to be calming, grounding. Instead, each system verification felt like reading her own eulogy. Primary oxygen supply, 7 hours, 42 minutes remaining. Secondary oxygen supply, 47 minutes emergency reserve. Suit pressure, 14.7 psi. Nominal. Temperature regulation, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Nominal. Power systems, 91% capacity. Communication systems, signal null. Location beacon, active. Broadcasting. Maneuvering fuel, 12% remaining. Everything functioned with a mechanical perfection that felt obscene against the abnormality of her situation. The suit was designed to keep her alive, but in doing so, it had created a tiny pocket of habitability in an environment that rejected human life with absolute indifference. She was, in essence, living inside a high-tech coffin. The sun emerged from behind the Earth's limb, and Martinez activated her helmet's polarizing filter. The light seemed different out here, away from the station's protective bulk. Sharper, more hostile. The rays carried information her eyes couldn't quite process, like a language written in photons and radiation. She tried the radio again, cycling through all frequencies. Static answered her, but within its hiss, she began to hear patterns. Not voices, exactly, but something that suggested communication, like listening to a conversation in a language so foreign that the brain couldn't even recognize it as speech. The pattern seemed to repeat every 4.7 seconds. She knew this because she began counting, using her suit's chronometer for precision. Always 4.7 seconds. The exact time it takes light to travel from Jupiter to Saturn at their closest approach. That fact surfaced in her mind unbidden, and she couldn't remember if it was true or if her brain was already manufacturing coincidences to create meaning from meaninglessness. She'd studied astronomical distances extensively during her training, but now the numbers felt like they were concealing something, as if the true distances between celestial bodies could only be measured in units of consciousness rather than space. The suit's temperature remained steady, but Martinez felt cold. Not the physical cold of space. Her thermal regulation was functioning perfectly, but a deeper cold that seemed to emanate from the void itself. It was the cold of vast distances, of thoughts too large for human minds to contain. She looked at her hands, floating before her in their armored gloves. The material was a marvel of engineering. Multiple layers of protection against vacuum, radiation, and micrometeorite impacts. But as she watched, the shadows on the glove's surface began to move strangely, forming patterns that reminded her of the static on her radio. She blinked, and the patterns disappeared, but she could still feel them there, like afterimages burned into her retinas. A slight movement caught her attention. One of her suit's external sensor packages had rotated slightly on its mounting. She hadn't touched it. There was no air resistance here, no force that could have moved it. And yet she watched as it rotated another fraction of a degree, its metal surface catching the sunlight at an angle that sent a lance of pain through her left eye. Martinez looked back at the earth. The Atlantic was visible now, a vast expanse of blue that didn't look like water anymore. It looked like something fluid was moving beneath the surface, something that operated on principles far removed from terrestrial oceanography. The cloud patterns over the Amazon had arranged themselves into what appeared to be mathematical equations, but they described geometries that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. She tried to remember her training about spatial disorientation and vacuum-induced hallucinations. The mind, they told her, will create patterns where none exist. It's a survival mechanism, an attempt to impose order on chaos. But what if the opposite were true? What if their perceived chaos was actually a pattern too vast to comprehend, and their ordered universe was the real hallucination? The sun glinted off something in the distance, probably a piece of space debris, though it seemed to move in a way that violated Kepler's laws of orbital mechanics. As she watched, it appeared to fold in on itself, collapsing into geometries that her eyes refused to process. The sight sent a wave of vertigo through her that the suit's gyroscopes couldn't compensate for. Her suit's clock showed that only 43 minutes had passed since the tether broke. That couldn't be right. She'd lived lifetimes in those minutes, watched civilizations rise and fall in the cloud patterns below. Time itself seemed to be becoming unreliable, stretching and contracting like a living thing. She tried the radio one final time, more out of ritual than hope. The static had changed again. Now it reminded her of breathing. Not human breathing, but the respiration of something that measured its breaths in centuries. Between the pulses of static, she heard what might have been words. Watching. Always. Between. Martinez shut off the radio with trembling fingers. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but rather its opposite, a presence so profound that it made sound itself seem like a crude approximation of something far more fundamental. She pulled up her suit's diagnostic programs and began running every test in the system. The numbers and procedures were comforting in their mundanity, even as a part of her mind whispered that mathematics itself was just a tiny subset of something far larger and more terrible. She needed to stay focused, needed to remain human for as long as possible, because increasingly, she was beginning to suspect that human consciousness was not the default state of the universe. It was an anomaly, a brief spark in an infinite darkness that thought in ways that would drive her mad if she began to understand them. 6 hours of oxygen remained. 6 hours until her body joined the other debris orbiting the Earth. But as she watched the shadows lengthening impossibly across her suit's surface, Martinez wondered if her mind would survive that long. Aye. The descent. By hour 3, Martinez began to notice the silence, not just the absence of sound. Her own heartbeat and breathing were loud enough in the suit, but something deeper, a silence that pressed against her mind like a physical weight, as if the vacuum itself was trying to crush her thoughts into a singularity of consciousness. She had experienced silence before, of course, the anechoic chamber during training, the quiet hours on night shift aboard the station, the desert stillness of her childhood home in New Mexico. But this was different. Those silences had been an absence. This was a presence. The suit's ambient noise became a symphony of reminders that she was still alive. The soft whir of the oxygen circulation system, the periodic click of the carbon dioxide scrubbers, the subtle hum of the power cells. She began to catalog these sounds, giving them names and personalities. The scrubber became Manuel, steady and reliable like her grandfather. The circulation system was Sarah, her daughter, always moving, always dancing. The power cell's hum she named after her wife, Helena, a constant source of energy and life. She started talking to herself, at first just status checks and oxygen levels, then stream of consciousness rambling about her life. She spoke of her childhood in New Mexico, of watching the stars with her father's telescope, how he taught her the constellations, his weathered hand pointing out patterns in the sky, while crickets chirped in the desert night. She talked about her first spacewalk, how she'd wept at the beauty of it, though she'd never admitted that to the psychologists during her debriefing. But even her voice began to sound strange, distorted. The words seemed to hang in the air inside her helmet, twisting into shapes that weren't quite language anymore. She watched as her breath fogged the inside of her visor in patterns that reminded her of the Mandelbrot set, fractals spiraling into infinity before fading away. "My name is Carmen Martinez," she said, trying to anchor herself in facts. "I am a senior engineer aboard the Helios station. I have a wife named Helena and a daughter named Sarah. I am currently experiencing psychological stress due to isolation and spatial disorientation." The words felt hollow, rehearsed. Was that really her voice? It seemed to echo strangely, as if coming from very far away, or perhaps from somewhere much too close. From inside her skull, rather than her throat. The stars had changed. She knew, intellectually, that she was seeing the same constellation she'd mapped as a child, but they looked wrong now. Orion's belt appeared to have 4 stars instead of 3. The Big Dipper's handle curved in a way that violated Euclidean geometry. When she blinked, the patterns shifted, forming connections that suggested purpose, as if the stars were nodes in some vast neural network, processing thoughts too enormous for human comprehension. She remembered a paper she'd read during her doctoral studies about stellar distribution patterns. The mathematician had proposed that the apparent randomness of star positions actually contained encoded information, like a cosmic version of steganography. The paper had been dismissed as fringe science. Its author's career effectively ended. Now, watching the constellations rearrange themselves when she wasn't looking directly at them, Martinez wondered if the mathematician had gone mad, not because he was wrong, but because he was right. Her suit's chronometer marked 3 hours and 27 minutes since the separation. The oxygen gauge showed just under 5 hours remaining, but the numbers seemed to flutter and dance, occasionally replacing themselves with symbols that belonged to no known mathematical system. She began counting her breaths, trying to calculate her oxygen consumption rate, but kept losing track around number 17. As if something was gently pulling her thoughts away from anything too rigidly logical. The Earth had completed another third of its rotation beneath her. The Mediterranean was visible now, its blue waters looking less like an ocean and more like an aperture into something deeper. The currents moved in ways that water shouldn't, forming spiral patterns that made her think of DNA helixes, but twisted through dimensions she couldn't quite perceive. Martinez tried reciting the periodic table, another attempt to hold onto rational thought. Hydrogen, atomic number 1. Helium, atomic number 2. Lithium. She stopped at carbon, the 6th element. Carbon, the basis of all known life. But why carbon? The question suddenly seemed intensely important. Out of all the elements that could have formed the backbone of terrestrial biochemistry, why had carbon been chosen? And who or what had done the choosing? She looked at her gloved hands again, thinking about the carbon atoms in her own body. Each one had been forged in the heart of a dying star, blown out into space by supernovas, collected by gravity into planets, and eventually assembled into her consciousness. But what if that process wasn't as random as science suggested? What if those carbon atoms carried memories of their stellar origins, and human consciousness was just a tiny eddy in a much larger flow of cosmic awareness? "Focus," she said aloud. "Focus on the concrete." But what was concrete out here? Einstein had proven that space and time were relative, that the apparently solid foundation of reality was actually as fluid as a dream. And in dreams, anything could happen. Anything could be true. She noticed that she had begun to salivate excessively, a physiological response to extreme stress. The droplets of saliva floated in her helmet, catching the starlight. Each droplet seemed to contain an entire universe, galaxies spiraling in the surface tension. She watched, mesmerize, as one droplet split into two, then four, then eight, dividing like cells but following patterns that cellular mitosis had never imagined. The suit's temperature regulation system clicked on, responding to her elevated body heat. The sound startled her, and for a moment, she forgot where she was. Was she floating in space, or was space floating in her? The distinction suddenly seemed meaningless. She remembered reading about the homunculus argument in philosophy, the idea that if there was a little person in your head watching your sensory inputs like a movie, there would have to be an even smaller person in that person's head, and so on ad infinitum. But what if it wasn't infinity that waited at the end of that regression? What if it was something else, something that watched and thought, and dreamed in ways that made human consciousness look like a candle flame next to a supernova? Her training had included exercises for maintaining psychological stability in isolation. Count backward from 100. Focus on your breathing. Think about loved ones. But these techniques assumed a reality that played by human rules. Out here, surrounded by infinite nothing that was beginning to feel more and more like infinite everything, human psychology seemed as quaint and limited as an abacus in a quantum computing lab. My name is Carmen Martinez. She tried again, but the words came out wrong, as if she were speaking them backward and forward simultaneously. She could feel her grasp on human identity beginning to slip, like trying to hold onto a soap bubble that was expanding into dimensions she couldn't perceive. The stars continued their impossible dance, and in their movement, she began to see patterns that reminded her of neurons firing in a cosmic brain. Each stellar fusion reaction was a thought, each gravitational wave a memory, each quantum fluctuation a dream. And humanity, with all its science and mathematics and carefully constructed models of reality, was just a fleeting synapse in that vast consciousness. 4 hours of oxygen remained. Or was it 5? The numbers on her display had begun to move in ways that suggested time itself was becoming unreliable. Martinez closed her eyes, but that only made things worse. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she could see things moving, vast shapes that seemed to be composed of angles that couldn't exist in normal spacetime. When she opened her eyes again, the whispers had begun.